As the saying goes, cute girls have all the luck. Chini Dong had barely woken up when her cheapskate father barged in, claiming to have earth-shattering good news. Seeing her father's mischievous grin, Chini Dong had a bad feeling. "My dear daughter," he began, "Daddy has wonderful news. The crown prince is selecting a concubine." Chin Dong pondered this. Still recovering from a recent illness, she wondered what the prince's concubine selection had to do with her. Her father, practically glowing with excitement, exclaimed, "Such a trivial matter is nothing for your old man. With my connections, I've already taken care of it." Chin Dong's expression shifted subtly. Her father beamed. "The Empress, touched by your deep affection, has issued a special decree allowing you to participate in the selection. The wedding can take place right after your recovery." Chini Dong felt her heart seize. She swayed and collapsed dramatically. "You're really my dear father, aren't you? Do I look happy about this? Happy my foot." The scene shifted. Moments ago, a pampered young lady, Chini Dong was now slumped over a desk, fast asleep in a classroom. A classmate, seeing her deep slumber, shook her shoulder anxiously. It turned out Chin Dong had time-traveled to ancient times. Her identity? The delicate daughter of a minister. And as luck would have it, she'd barely arrived before becoming a candidate for crown princess, all thanks to her father's help. She'd racked her brains to avoid the selection, narrowly escaping once, only to fall into this pit dug by her foolish father. Thinking fast, she decided to continue feigning illness. To avoid delaying the selection, "Father, please decline on my behalf." The minister gave a sly smile. "Silly girl, at a time like this, you're still worried about the selection? I've already spoken to the Empress. The selection is a done deal. It starts today. The young ladies have all been specially trained. They're not only elegant and graceful, but also incredibly fit. You have nothing to worry about." Chin Dong's composure shattered, but reality proved even more shattering. The next day, crown princess training officially began. Balancing a porcelain bowl on her head, back ramrod straight, though behind her was terrifying. Chin Dong took mincing steps forward. The mo cane in hand, ensured even her kneeling posture was impeccably trained. And posture was just the first step. Inner refinement was also essential. Painting and calligraphy had to be mastered. Seeing her rather unique rendition of a cow, the moog snapped, grabbed her cane, and chased Chin Dong, beating her soundly. Chin Dong could only flee. Hearing the commotion, the minister, filled with expectations for his daughter, smiled with satisfaction. Chin Dong's cries echoed through the courtyard. This was no life for a human being. Lying in bed, she felt utterly defeated. Her maid rushed to comfort her. "Just endure the selection, and everything will be all right." Chin Dong scoffed. "What stupid selection? It's torture. Only food can soothe my wounded soul." But then, Chin Dong stared blankly at her bowl. Where was her meat? The maid explained that since Chin Dong was just recovering, the Vuowook had ordered a bland diet. Chin Dong decided to run away. She bolted for the door, only to be met by a phalanx of Vuogs. Good heavens, one wasn't enough. They brought 12 maids to watch her. Chin Dong felt another heart attack coming on. She collapsed, the harsh reality transforming into a bitter smile. And so, under the relentless tutelage of the Vogue and the watchful eyes of 20 maids, Chin Dong continued her blissful life day after day. Finally, the crown princess selection officially began. Daughters of noble families lined up, a truly magnificent spectacle. As the minister's daughter, Chin Dong was scheduled to perform, showcasing her beauty to the prince. The thought of performing sent her into another spiral of despair. As a veteran social phobe, the idea of performing was practically a death sentence. But then again, why wouldn't she even know she was supposed to perform? Wasn't this supposed to be a matchmaking event? Why the sudden talent show? Still, since this was a competition to become the crown prince's consort, naturally, all the noble ladies present had to showcase their skills. Take Miss Huang Euro, daughter of Magistrate Huang over there. Exceptionally skilled at the zither, she was determined to secure the position of crown princess. And Miss Yu, daughter of the current left chancellor, was proficient in all the arts, zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. She would undoubtedly be Chin Dong's greatest rival. Unfazed, Chin Dong let out a belch, redolent of 82 vintage vinegar. Who cared who was who? She had no desire to be the crown princess anyway. Still, the crown prince was certainly living the life. So many beauties vying for his attention. Meanwhile, her maid worried about what Chin Dong would perform. Chin Edong pondered. Zither, chess, calligraphy, painting, she was utterly hopeless at all of them. Her only real skill was Taekwondo. Performing a barehanded brick-breaking routine in this setting would certainly be innovative. Inspiration struck. Her maid, however, remained blissfully unaware of the impending disaster. Inside the grand hall, the selection process for the Crown Prince's consort was well underway. Suddenly, the announcement of the Crown Prince's arrival echoed through the crowd. The assembled noble ladies were instantly captivated by his magnificent appearance. The power of infatuation, it seemed, transcended time and space. He was as refined as jade, a peerless gentleman. His handsome features and elegant attire even brought a blush to Qin Yidong's cheeks. With the ringing of a bell by a young eunuch, the selection ceremony officially began. The first to perform was Miss Zheng. Her hands gracefully danced across the zither strings, producing a captivating melody. Qin Yidong, in the audience, clapped enthusiastically. The other young ladies, taken aback by this strange behavior, stared. Why would anyone cheer for their competition? Her maid quickly hushed her, but it was clear she genuinely enjoyed the music. One after another, the noble ladies showcased their talents. Watching these refined young women, each a picture of grace and elegance, Qin Yidong couldn't help but think, wouldn't it be wonderful if they were all hers? As another contestant finished her performance, the young eunuch presiding over the selection finally called Qin Yidong's name. In an instant, she became the center of attention. Already? She asked, surprised. The eunuch calmly nodded. Panic seized Qin Yidong. Couldn't she just enjoy the show? Her maid offered words of encouragement, but Qin Yidong just wanted to disappear. As a seasoned social phobe, even introducing herself was a struggle. The sheer number of people in the audience was overwhelming. Overcome by nerves, as she stepped onto the stage, she completely forgot what she was supposed to do. Seeing her flustered state, the other ladies began to snicker. Just then, the eunuch announced the start of Qin Yidong's performance. The talent she had chosen was explosive. At the mention of Taekwondo, murmurs rippled through the crowd. What on earth was Taekwondo? Surely, something vulgar. On stage, Qin Yidong took a deep breath. The essential principles of Taekwondo, swift punches, proper posture, and an unwavering display of strength. As she struck a pose, a hush fell over the audience. Qin Yidong, sensing their confusion, felt a wave of embarrassment. Then, the hall erupted in laughter. What a ridiculous display. She looked like a monkey performing tricks at a zoo. Qin Yidong bristled at their mockery. Her martial arts skills had won countless awards. Fine, she'd show them a real performance. She focused her energy, and the audience, assuming her act was over, began to disperse in disappointment. Then, Qin Yidong closed her eyes. He slowly lifted his left hand, facing the large audience before him, and bellowed, "Bring me a brick." The maid below the stage was dumbfounded. "Miss, what do you need a brick for? What the hell do you think? I'm going to perform brick breaking for you." Qin Yidong's words caused an uproar. A young eunuch nearby suddenly looked troubled, casting a pleading glance towards the crown prince in the distance. The crown prince, however, remained calm and collected. "Since the young lady wants a brick," he declared, "then give her one. This prince also wants to see what tricks she can pull off." Hearing this, the young eunuch immediately ordered someone to bring a brick. Qin Yidong, standing to the side, wore a thoughtful expression. Suddenly, a glint flashed in Qin Yidong's eyes. Two servants, carrying a single, paltry brick, arrived before her. Looking at the thin red brick, Qin Yidong's face displayed a look of disdain. She took another deep breath. The Qin family members watching from below couldn't help but feel anxious. Minister Qin worried that Qin Yidong would hurt herself. Qin Yidong, her face impassive, raised her hand. Under the shocked gazes of everyone below, she slammed her palm down on the red brick. The audience gasped. Qin Yidong's face darkened. Her delicate hand, which had struck the brick, let out a pathetic thud. The next moment, Qin Yidong cried out in pain, clutching her wrist. The onlookers erupted in laughter. Whether the brick broke or not, this was definitely the most entertaining performance they had seen all day. The noble ladies to the side sneered. As expected, it's just a vulgar display. The other well-bred young women stared, dumbfounded. The two young noblemen watched the incredibly awkward Qin Yidong on stage. "I wonder whose daughter this is," one murmured, to be so interesting. Rumor had it the minister's daughter was gentle and lovely. Clearly, rumors can't be trusted. Everyone present was laughing at the comical failure of Qin Yidong's performance. Only her father went up on stage, concerned about her injury. The crown prince, holding a small child, couldn't tear his eyes away from the scene. This is so humiliating, Qin Yidong thought. I have all these skills, but I'm defeated by this frail body. But this outcome isn't bad. With this commotion, father will surely give up on the idea of me competing for the crown princess position. Father, I'm sorry I embarrassed you, she sobbed to her father, while inwardly rejoicing. The crown prince wouldn't be so bizarre as to choose a woman who made such a fool of herself as his consort, would he? As she thought this, Qin Yidong suddenly stumbled and collapsed. Her face turned deathly pale. In the blink of an eye, Qin Yidong lay motionless on the ground. This frightened the presiding eunuch and the head eunuch. Finally, I can get some rest, Qin Yidong thought. And so, after Qin Yidong's spectacular display of ineptitude, the selection for the crown princess came to a close. A nobleman quietly pushed open the crown prince's door. He had come to inquire about the results of the selection and discover who had won the prince's favor. The crown prince, however, remained enigmatic. It was clear from his expression that he already had someone in mind. Was it the graceful dancer, Yu Yu, or the musically talented Huang Yuro? The nobleman wondered aloud. Or perhaps he'll choose the brick breaker? That little thing was quite amusing. Imagine having someone to put on a show for you when you're tired. That's not a bad suggestion. The nobleman was stunned. Is the crown prince joking? He wondered. If he actually marries that woman, he'll become the laughingstock of the entire city. But the prince's expression didn't suggest he was jesting. Qin Yidong was now in a state of panic. In this world, deceiving the emperor was a crime punishable by death. If she was discovered feigning illness to avoid the selection, she would certainly meet a grim end. But after only 2.5 seconds of panic, Qin Yidong's anxiety subsided. After all, she had made such a spectacle of herself during the selection that any sane crown prince wouldn't choose her as his consort. Finally, she thought, I can enjoy a peaceful life at home. Just then, her father burst into her room. Her father, who always brought good news, had another big announcement to share. The crown prince, second only to the emperor himself, had issued a decree. Qin Yidong was to be chosen as a concubine. In a few days, she was to enter the palace and be wed. Hearing this news, Qin Yidong felt like she'd swallowed a landmine, her composure utterly shattered. As night fell, she lay in bed, tossing and turning, unable to sleep at the thought of marrying into the royal family. Did this crown prince have some strange fetish? All the other young, noble women participating in the selection were so accomplished. Why, she wondered, had this strange fellow chosen her? The situation had escalated to a critical point. She had to find a way to escape this impending marriage. The next day, Qin Yidong, feigning illness, entered the room, clutching her forehead. Suddenly, her foot caught on the threshold, sending her sprawling forward. Her maid, witnessing this, was utterly bewildered. Qin Yidong lay on the floor, her body trembling theatrically. A moment later, she dramatically fainted. The entire performance was executed with surprising fluidity. Her maid cried out in alarm. Even if it meant feigning death, Qin Yidong was determined not to marry that strange crown prince. The maid rushed to her side and helped her up. She lay quietly in bed. Soon, her father, Minister Qin, arrived with a physician, hurrying into the room. He looked at his precious daughter with a pained expression. Qin Yidong, in turn, put on a display of frail vulnerability. Seeing his daughter in such apparent distress, Minister Qin immediately ordered the physician to diagnose her illness. The expressions on their faces were grave. The atmosphere in the room grew tense. But then, something strange happened. After a thorough examination, the physician couldn't find any sign of illness. Qin Yidong lay on the bed, her face impassive. She was merely pretending to be sick. Although she wasn't truly ill, she couldn't let the physician discover her charade. So, in the next moment, Qin Yidong began to feign another bout of symptoms. Seeing this, Minister Qin broke out in a cold sweat. His precious daughter seemed perfectly healthy one moment, and the next, she was complaining of headaches and stomach pains. Seizing the opportunity, while her father was distracted with concern, Qin Yidong tried to broach the subject of calling off the marriage to the crown prince. But her father, still focused on her supposed illness, urged the physician to examine her again. Seeing this unfold, Chin Dong, still feigning illness in bed, felt a surge of triumph. Her plans seemed to be working. The physician and her father were both deeply concerned. Just then, a man entered the room. It was someone from the Crown Prince's palace, sent to bring Chin Dong for a pre-wedding medical examination. Chin Dong was both amused and exasperated. Ancient customs were surprisingly forward-thinking. To prevent potential consorts from concealing illnesses, the court had implemented a mandatory pre-wedding examination. As he spoke, the imperial physician entered the room. Seeing that she couldn't escape this ordeal, Chin Dong panicked. The young eunuch reassured her that it was merely a formality and nothing to worry about. Hearing this, Minister Chin stepped forward. Chin Dong hadn't been feeling well these past few days, and this was a perfect opportunity for her to get a proper examination. Meanwhile, Chin Dong was desperately trying to figure out how to escape. She wasn't technically deceiving the emperor, since the examination was meant to uncover concealed illnesses and she wasn't actually sick. Even if they didn't find anything wrong, the physician wouldn't say anything. A hush fell over the room. After a thorough examination, Minister Chin anxiously inquired about his daughter's condition. As expected, the physician declared that Chin Dong was perfectly healthy. Just then, Chin Dong cried out. She clutched her stomach and began rolling around on the bed, startling the physicians. But the imperial physician, with decades of experience, remained unconvinced. He couldn't find any trace of illness. Seeing Chin Dong writhing on the bed, Minister Chin began to doubt the imperial physician's skills. Had his medical expertise somehow regressed? But the imperial physician, Physician Liu, stood firm. If he diagnosed a healthy person as sick, he would be nothing more than a quack. With that, Physician Liu turned and left. His medical skills were renowned within the palace. If even he declared Chin Dong healthy, what could be the matter with her? Baffled, the eunuch decided to return to the palace and request more physicians to examine Chin Dong. Chin Dong sat up in bed, watching the eunuch depart, and finally breathed a sigh of relief. She hadn't anticipated the pre-wedding examination. She lay back down, ready to sleep, but her father, mistaking her exhaustion for a worsening of her symptoms, feared she was about to collapse. Minister Chin and the physician rushed to her side. Fortunately, the physician realized that Chin Dong had simply fallen asleep from exhaustion. Minister Chin, determined to get to the bottom of this, ordered every renowned physician in the capital summoned to examine his daughter. Meanwhile, Physician Liu reported the day's events to the Crown Prince. The Crown Prince burst out laughing. This young woman was certainly amusing. He decided he had to meet her himself. Late that night, Chin Dong sat alone in the kitchen, despondent. She hadn't eaten all day in her efforts to avoid the Crown Prince's selection. The food on the table had been completely overturned. Chin Dong felt like a starving ghost reborn. Just then, a burst of laughter came from outside the courtyard. Hidden in the kitchen, she startled. Peeking through the crack in the door, a wave of unease washed over her. But in the next moment, the unfamiliar man bowed respectfully to Chin Dong. He explained that he was a junior kitchen servant and had come to investigate the noise he'd heard. Chin Dong's mind raced. "I was just taking a look around," she stammered. She couldn't let him discover her true purpose, a desperate midnight raid on the pantry. Caught red-handed, she racked her brains for an excuse to dismiss the man and escape. Even a simple meal was proving impossible. Fate, it seemed, was against her. Then, out of the blue, the man brought up the Crown Prince's consort selection. "What's so bad about marrying the Crown Prince?" he asked. "Fine clothes, delicious food, riches, and honor." Chin Dong scoffed internally. She had no desire to spend her days as a glorified servant, vying for the attention of a man she didn't even like, along with a dozen other women. Was the Crown Prince's mind addled? He had so many beautiful and talented women to choose from, yet he picked her, the one who'd made a complete fool of herself. She was feigning illness out of pure desperation. But the servant's next words sent a shock wave through her, followed by a sputtering cough. "Love at first sight," he'd said. Preposterous. Chin Dong would never believe it. What sane man would fall for a woman who'd publicly humiliated herself at the selection ceremony? That imbecile Crown Prince, he'd better have me beheaded today, then I won't have to marry him, she muttered under her breath. "Oh, and by the way," she added, fixing the man with a mock-sweet smile, "keep tonight's little incident a secret, won't you?" With that, she swept out of the kitchen, leaving the servant staring after her with a sly, enigmatic smile. 3 days later, Chin Yidong lay listlessly on her bed. The crown prince still hadn't rescinded his decision, nor had he sent anyone to arrest her. Was she truly doomed to marry into the royal palace? "Oh, heavens," she groaned. "Please have mercy on me. I really don't want to marry him." Elsewhere, a refined young gentleman entered the crown prince's study. He'd assumed the prince's interest in Chin Yidong was a passing whim, but it seemed he was determined to marry her. The crown prince greeted him with a faint smile. Hadn't this very gentleman encouraged him to choose Chin Yidong before? Now he was singing a different tune. The gentleman claimed he'd merely been jesting. Marrying Chin Yidong would make the crown prince the laughingstock of the entire city, he argued. Finally, the prince dropped the pretense. He explained that he'd chosen Chin Yidong precisely because of her apparent lack of wit. She wouldn't be a spy planted by someone else. Besides, certain intriguing aspects of her personality had piqued his interest. Countless women coveted the position of crown princess, yet Chin Yidong actively avoided it, preferring execution to marriage. Someone like that was unlikely to pose a threat. The gentleman was astonished. Such a woman truly existed? She seemed harmless enough, but considering everything, Chin Yidong's behavior seemed deliberately calculated, a performance designed to mislead the crown prince. But the prince remained confident, certain he had everything under control. The wedding day approached swiftly. On this bittersweet day, the day Chin Yidong would step into the perceived tomb of marriage, a throng of servants from the minister's estate waited outside her door, ready to escort her to the matrimonial execution grounds. Female palace officials stood by, equally prepared. Despite her resistance, Chin Yidong had no choice but to submit to her fate. Meanwhile, the crown prince, mounted on his steed, set off to collect his bride. The procession wound through the city, accompanied by the clang of gongs and drums. The prince, radiating an air of cheerful anticipation, looked forward to the upcoming ceremony. The gentleman beside him glanced up. "How do you feel about the impending nuptials, Your Highness?" he inquired. The prince responded with a playful smirk. "I wonder if our little Chin Yidong will perform a breaking bricks with her chest act at her own wedding," he mused. The procession soon arrived at the minister's estate. According to ancient custom, the bride's feet mustn't touch the ground before the ceremony. Adorned in a phoenix crown and elaborate robes, Chin Yidong struggled under the weight of the heavy ornaments. To accommodate Chin Yidong, the prince had dispensed with many of the more cumbersome rituals. He even spoke kindly of her to the attending servants, expressing his desire for a relaxed, companionable marriage, free from unnecessary constraints. Finally, the moment of departure arrived. Minister Chin placed his most treasured daughter in the crown prince's hands. As the prince lifted Chin Yidong, the unexpected tenderness of the gesture sent a shiver down her spine. A bridal carry. In all her life, no man had ever held her like this. Turning to his father-in-law, the prince promised to cherish and protect Chin Yidong. Minister Chin beamed, his face etched with satisfaction. The auspicious hour had arrived. The crown prince carried Chin Yidong into the bridal sedan chair. With the wedding officiant's command, the 8-bearer palanquin carrying Chin Yidong gradually moved away from her father, Minister Chin's estate. The thought that from now on, returning home will be difficult filled Chin Yidong with a deep sadness, especially when she thought of her opportunistic father. At that moment, Chin Yidong made a firm resolution. If that scoundrel crown prince dared to mistreat her, she would escape the palace at the first opportunity. The wedding hall in the crown prince's residence was solemn and grand. The civil and military officials present were all smiles. Under the watchful eyes of the entire court, the bride and groom bowed to heaven and earth. This wedding was considerably simpler than traditional ceremonies. Despite this, Chin Yidong still felt utterly exhausted. The couple slowly bowed to each other. Finally, the moment arrived to enter the bridal chamber. It had to be said, to accommodate her, the crown prince had indeed made the wedding relaxed and simple, and so on. Just now, the matron had said something about entering the bridal chamber. Who enters the bridal chamber? Chini Dong's mind practically exploded. The thought of having to do that kind of embarrassing thing with someone she didn't like was no less agonizing than being slowly sliced to death. She absolutely could not consummate the marriage with the crown prince. She had to find a way to escape this predicament. Meanwhile, the crown prince pushed open the window and looked out. It was supposed to be the perfect moment for the bridal chamber, yet he lingered in the banquet hall, reluctant to leave. A moment of spring night is worth 1,000 gold pieces. No one understood why the crown prince hadn't left yet. But the crown prince, with an air of nonchalance, explained. He wasn't leaving because he wanted to see what kind of surprise Chini Dong would have in store for him. Inside the bridal chamber, Chini Dong was contemplating how to avoid the crown prince's affections. She looked at the round table in the distance, and a sudden idea sparked in her mind. A gleeful smile spread across her face. Chin Dong scattered beans all over the bed, a dense, formidable layer. With an air of triumph, she prepared for a showdown with the crown prince. She glanced at the empty doorway. Suddenly, a sound startled her. Hurried footsteps seemed to be approaching from outside. Panic seized Chini Dong. She quickly covered herself with a bridal veil, as if nothing had happened, and sat quietly on the bed. Had the crown prince finally arrived? Looking at the feet drawing closer, Chini Dong's heart was filled with mixed emotions. But the person who entered wasn't the crown prince. It was the crown prince's personal maid, there to help Chin Dong wash up. Hearing this, Chin Dong awkwardly lifted her veil. "Where is the crown prince? Isn't his highness coming?" she asked. The maid truthfully reported that the crown prince had drunk too much earlier, wasn't feeling well, and had already retired to his study. Chin Dong instantly breathed a sigh of relief. Good thing the guy didn't come. Otherwise, I have to figure out how to deal with him. But what about this bed full of booby traps? The maid moved forward to tidy the bed. Resigned, Chini Dong could only awkwardly thank the maid. Late into the night, the crown prince sat leisurely in his study, sipping tea. As the saying goes, a moment of spring night is worth 1,000 gold pieces. This crown prince was remarkably composed. "Aren't you going to the bridal chamber?" "No," the crown prince replied firmly, startling his close friend. He wasn't afraid of gossip. Was he really, as the rumors suggested, ahem? "You pervert! Don't you dare get any ideas about me." The crown prince's face darkened. He hadn't gone to the bridal chamber because he had sensed Chin Dong's reluctance. He didn't want to intrude. Meanwhile, Chin Dong was sound asleep. She slept straight through until the sun was high in the sky. Noticing their mistress had awakened, the maids hurried into the room to attend to her. Chini Dong was taken aback. She just needed to wash her face. Did it really require so many people? The maids then helped her into fresh clothes. Used to casual attire, Chini Dong, under the maid's watchful eyes, adopted a more refined demeanor. Afterward, she began her martial arts practice. Something felt off about this married life. Hadn't she married the crown prince? Why hadn't she seen him at all? The young woman, despite having just gotten married, had almost forgotten that fact. She was reminded that the crown prince was attending court that morning, which was why she hadn't seen him. But Chin Dong fell into deep thought. The crown prince hadn't even come to the bridal chamber on their wedding night. Was it deliberate or unintentional? Either way, it was fine by her. They could stay out of each other's way, preferably forever. The thought filled Chin Dong with excitement. 3 days passed in a blink. During this time, Chin Dong's life was comfortable and carefree. She ate and practiced martial arts on schedule. The mysterious crown prince hadn't bothered her. But just then, the maid's chatter caught her attention. "The crown prince hasn't been to the crown princess's chambers in 3 days. Is it because she's hideously ugly? That's why he can't bear to see her. And I heard that during the selection, Chin Dong only managed to sneak into the crown prince's residence by shamelessly clinging on." In the distance, Chin Dong overheard the conversation. Furious, she couldn't even stomach another bite of her meal. She crept to the wall, eavesdropping on the servants' gossip. This crown princess is utterly useless. A complete waste of space. If it weren't for her well-connected father, she'd never have set foot in the crown prince's palace. Hearing this, Chin Dong seethed. It was clearly that scoundrel, the crown prince, who had shamelessly insisted on marrying her. Chin Dong's roar silenced the courtyard. The two gossiping servants, seeing the crown princess herself before them, were paralyzed with fear. Then, Chin Dong spoke, her voice sharp. "The crown prince hasn't entered the bridal chamber for days. Could it be that the rumors about his inclinations are true?" She turned to the servant who had spoken ill of her, Chunxia, and asked her directly what she thought of the crown prince's supposed proclivities. Chunxiao immediately clamped her mouth shut. Qin Yidong, however, seized the opportunity, declaring that Chunxiao's silence was an admission of the truth of the rumors. With that, Qin Yidong turned and swept back to her chambers. If she was going to be the subject of such scandalous gossip, she certainly wasn't going to be the only one implicated. The two servants exchanged uneasy glances. Strange expressions crept across their faces. We've heard whispers about the crown prince's preferences, but to think that someone so handsome and young Master Nan is always visiting his chambers. No wonder the crown princess has been so neglected since the wedding. The rumors began to twist in a fascinating direction. 2 days quickly passed. Now, the entire crown prince's palace buzzed with whispers about the crown prince's supposed peculiarities. As crown princess, Qin Yidong was naturally affected by the gossip, but then she burst into laughter, tears streaming down her face. She hadn't realized how easily these people could be manipulated. The crown prince's palace was far more interesting and comfortable than her father's estate. After all this leisure, it was time to devise a plan to strengthen her frail constitution. Meanwhile, a young eunuch reported everything that had transpired in the palace to the crown prince. The crown prince listened, a smile playing on his lips. He hadn't expected the very consort he'd swallowed his pride to marry to spread such rumors about him. Yet, he didn't seem angry. He even instructed the eunuch to ensure Qin Yidong's safety. The eunuch bowed and obeyed. Watching him leave, the crown prince's expression was enigmatic. Moments later, a guard entered, announcing the crown princess's request for an audience. The crown prince's interest was piqued. He was curious to see what Qin Yidong was up to now. Qin Yidong and her maid stood outside. The crown prince didn't open the door for a long time, leading Qin Yidong to believe he was deliberately avoiding her. If he truly refused to see her, how would she carry out her grand plan? Just as she thought this, the doors to the crown prince's study swung open. The guard summoned Qin Yidong to meet the crown prince. This was precisely what Qin Yidong had hoped for. However, mindful of her position, she maintained a dignified composure before the servants. The crown prince sat at his desk, seemingly absorbed in reviewing memorials. Qin Yidong approached and bowed. Though each harbored their own secret intentions, the two maintained a veneer of polite formality. Qin Yidong looked at her husband, whom she hadn't seen in days. She explained that she had come to request his assistance. The crown prince assumed that she was simply seeking his attention after days of being ignored. Qin Yidong vehemently denied this. Confronted by her seemingly innocent demeanor, the crown prince, believing himself in control, responded with a regal, "Speak freely." With that, Qin Yidong walked towards the crown prince and began to scrutinize him intently. Even the crown prince, heir to the throne, was taken aback by her inexplicable behavior. Then, Qin Yidong reached out and firmly pinched his shoulder. The crown prince's expression turned to one of bewildered discomfort. But she wasn't finished. Like someone possessed, Qin Yidong's hand slid down from his shoulder. Watching her strange movements, the crown prince's mind reeled. The scene unfolding before them horrified the attending servants. They had never imagined the crown princess to be so bold. The crown prince sprang back, putting the distance of a table between himself and Qin Yidong. "What in the world are you doing? It's only been a few days. You're a proper lady from a prestigious family. Why are you acting so strangely?" Qin Yidong smiled knowingly. "Your Highness, don't misunderstand. I don't have any malicious intent. I was just checking your Highness's health. As they say, a strong body makes for a strong nation. As the future ruler of Qi, your Highness naturally needs a robust physique to shoulder such a heavy responsibility." Hearing this, a look of relief spread across the crown prince's face. But the maid standing nearby thought Qin Yidong's actions were a prelude to something intimate with the crown prince. However, Qin Yidong's next words nearly made her choke. "I came here to ask your Highness to go running with me." It seemed the crown princess's thought process couldn't be understood by ordinary people. A newly married couple who hadn't even consummated their marriage agreeing to go running together after days apart? What a bizarre turn of events. But Qin Yidong was determined. She insisted on the crown prince joining her for exercise. To this, the crown prince responded magnanimously. "A mere run? Very well, I shall accompany you." But before that, he added, "You must promise me one thing." Qin Dong, with her own hidden agenda, readily agreed to the Crown Prince's request. But the Crown Prince decided to be cryptic. He said he hadn't thought of what it was yet. He would tell Qin Dong later when he remembered. Qin Dong readily agreed. "Since we have an agreement, starting tomorrow, we'll go running in the mountains together." "Wait, I thought we were going running. Why has it changed to running in the mountains? You're so unpredictable. You?" Just as dawn broke, the Crown Prince lay peacefully asleep in his bed. Suddenly, a flurry of knocks startled him awake. Qin Dong, dressed in vibrant red, burst into the room. Full of energy, she immediately tried to pull her new husband out of bed to go running in the mountains. The Crown Prince bolted upright in bed, startled. "It's still dark out. Why must we go running in the mountains at this hour?" The next moment, Qin Dong placed a hand on his shoulder. "My dear husband, didn't we agree yesterday? I'm already here, so let's just go." And so, Qin Dong dragged a reluctant Crown Prince off on their mountain running expedition. The next morning, Qin Dong, as agreed, once again dragged her dear Crown Prince from his slumber. On the third day, Qin Dong continued to relish every opportunity to torment the Crown Prince. He, in turn, seemed to be adapting, even attempting to snatch a few precious moments of sleep while being dragged down the mountain. Finally, on the nth day, the perpetually sleep-deprived Crown Prince could no longer endure Qin Dong's relentless torture. Qin Dong responded nonchalantly, "If your highness is tired, I can go running by myself." The Crown Prince's masculine pride flared. If Qin Dong, a woman, wasn't complaining, how could he, a man, be the first to give up? With a grand gesture, he declared that he wouldn't need to be dragged out of bed today. He would walk down the mountain himself. But his bravado was short-lived. The next moment, he collapsed, exhausted, in his study. If he couldn't escape this torment, he wouldn't suffer alone. The following morning, Qin Dong was awakened by a commotion outside. She slowly stepped out of her room. A line of maids stood in formation, chanting in unison. They were drilling right there in Qin Dong's residence. What was going on? A puzzled expression crossed Qin Dong's face. Suddenly, the Crown Prince appeared behind her. After much deliberation, he had decided that exercise shouldn't be limited to just himself. The servants of the Crown Prince's residence also needed to be strong and healthy. "So, I've instructed the household staff to run laps around the garden every morning. Isn't your husband incredibly clever, my dear?" Hearing this, Qin Dong felt as if a giant cauldron had been dropped over her head. The next moment, she stormed out of the garden, fuming. The rhythmic sound of running feet echoed throughout the Crown Prince's residence. Time flew by, and a month quickly passed. After a full month of this training regimen, the maid Xuanxia had unexpectedly developed a set of remarkably well-defined muscles. This was all thanks to the month-long exercise. And it wasn't just the maids in the residence. Even Qin Dong herself had become incredibly strong. This startled Qin Dong. After all, the exercise was meant for her own benefit. A young woman like herself, having only muscles wasn't ideal. She needed to find a way to shape her physique. So, Qin Dong began to rack her brains. Just then, a maid brought unwelcome news. The Crown Prince's wet nurse was coming to the residence to confront Qin Dong. Qin Dong was puzzled by the status of the Crown Prince's wet nurse. Faced with the maid's insistent urging, Qin Dong quickly got out of bed to bathe and dress. In the hallway, the wet nurse was hurrying towards Qin Dong's quarters. The Crown Prince clearly spent every day alone with the Crown Princess in the back garden. So why was the wet nurse so angry? But the wet nurse was indeed furious. Despite the couple's outward display of affection, rumors circulated that their trips to the back garden were solely for running and exercise. The Crown Prince could be forgiven for his naivete, but surely the Crown Princess should know better. This time, the wet nurse intended to see for herself what kind of woman this Crown Princess was, the one who had apparently bewitched the usually composed Crown Prince, turning him head over heels and robbing him of his reason. Xuanxia was busy preparing for the wet nurse's arrival. Qin Dong, still new to the palace, was curious about the wet nurse's status and position. The Crown Prince had lost his mother at a young age. Because of this, the Emperor had appointed a wet nurse for him. It was this wet nurse who had raised the Crown Prince with her own hands, and thus they shared an exceptionally close bond. The Crown Prince regarded her as his own mother. Hearing this, Qin Dong suddenly understood. But why was the wet nurse so eager to see her? Could it be to pressure her and the Crown Prince to produce an heir? None of these women in ancient times were simple, but the maid assured her that the wet nurse had a gentle nature. Unless something significant had happened, she wouldn't likely give Qin Yidong a hard time. With that, the wet nurse pushed open Qin Yidong's door. Qin Yidong sat on the bed, observing this woman she was meeting for the first time. The wet nurse wasn't arrogant because of her favored position. Even when facing Qin Yidong, she followed protocol and bowed respectfully. Qin Yidong silently observed the wet nurse's demeanor. The wet nurse dipped her head slightly, but the moment she saw Qin Yidong, she couldn't help but frown, anger flickering in her eyes. She had heard about Qin Yidong's embarrassing incident during the selection process some time ago, but the wet nurse hadn't cared about that. Now, however, the crown princess represented the crown prince's residence. Qin Yidong's every action had to reflect her position. Qin Yidong smiled on the surface, but she understood perfectly. This wet nurse had indeed come to find fault with her. As a consort, embroidery was an essential skill for a refined young lady. Qin Yidong was not skilled in needlework or embroidery. Therefore, the wet nurse had specifically invited Yuan Zixian, the most beautiful woman in the Qi kingdom, to tutor Qin Yidong in embroidery. Hearing this, Qin Yidong immediately refused. She didn't have time to learn embroidery. She simply had no talent for it. No one could teach her. Therefore, the wet nurse needn't trouble herself on her behalf. The wet nurse's face hardened. The ability to teach wasn't Yuan Zixian's problem. As for the crown princess, she simply needed to apply herself. With that, the wet nurse, giving Qin Yidong no chance to argue, bowed and left the bedchamber. Watching the wet nurse's retreating figure, Qin Yidong and Chuanxia both frowned. Whatever comes, they would face it head-on. She didn't believe she couldn't handle a mere Yuan Zixian. The next moment, Qin Yidong slowly rose and instructed Chuanxia to send a bowl of the medicine prepared yesterday to the crown prince. Late into the night, the unnamed concoction emitted a strange odor. The crown prince looked at the dark liquid his beloved consort had sent him, his expression grim. "What is this?" Qin Yidong, the crown princess, presented the bowl of medicine to the crown prince before he could even ask. "This, Your Highness, is a specially concocted restorative tonic made with 10 precious ingredients." At her words, the crown prince shot to his feet. Despite her outwardly harmless demeanor, the crown prince couldn't shake the feeling that his crown princess was actively trying to poison him. Qin Yidong, seemingly oblivious to his suspicion, urged him, "Your Highness, please drink your medicine. It won't be as effective if it gets cold." Seeing her insistence, the crown prince mustered his courage, took the bowl from her hands, and downed the contents in one gulp. The taste made his face contort in a grimace. The next moment, he turned abruptly and, under Qin Yidong's puzzled gaze, practically fled the room. "What on earth was that?" he muttered. Qin Yidong offered a small, enigmatic smile. "Just a simple restorative tonic, Your Highness. This tonic is incredibly potent," he thought, his face flushing crimson. Qin Yidong's eyes widened in alarm. Before her, the crown prince swayed, his strong frame suddenly unsteady. Quick as a flash, he stumbled forward, collapsing onto Qin Yidong. A wave of inexplicable heat washed over him, leaving him drenched in sweat. He reached out, cupping Qin Yidong's chin, a jolt of electricity passing between them. Without warning, the two, married for some time, but still strangers in many ways, kissed. Qin Yidong's cheeks burned. "My first kiss. Gone just like that. That bastard. Give me back my first kiss." With a resounding splash, Qin Yidong flipped the crown prince over her shoulder, sending him tumbling into a nearby pool. The shock of the cold water seemed to snap the crown prince back to his senses. Immediately, shouts of "Man overboard" echoed throughout the crown prince's residence. The next day, in the second prince's residence, a beautiful woman knelt silently on the floor. The second prince looked down at Yuan Zixian, his expression grave. This mission must succeed. Failure is not an option. Yuan Zixian bowed her head in acknowledgement. A wicked smile played on the second prince's lips. "I wonder what tricks the crown prince is playing now," he mused. Back at the crown prince's residence, Nangongzi, having heard about the crown prince's mishap, erupted in laughter. Drugged, then dumped in a koi pond. To think the ever-so-dignified crown prince brought low like this. And I thought the crown princess was harmless. Who knew she had such a vicious streak? It's the scandal of the century. The crown prince, however, quickly steered the conversation back to business. He had previously entrusted Nangongzi with a private matter. and it was time for an update. Outside the door, Qin Dong and her maid lingered, hesitant to enter. They exchanged furtive glances, like conspirators about to embark on some clandestine mission. Just as Qin Dong reached the door, Ningongzi's boisterous laughter gave her pause. Peeking inside, she recognized the familiar figure and froze. The man inside was remarkably audacious, openly mocking the crown prince. Qin Dong, observing him from the doorway, couldn't help but wonder if he was quite right in the head. The crown prince, surprisingly, didn't seem offended. Instead, he brought up an embarrassing incident involving Nan Gongzi and the pleasure house. Nan Gongzi paled, begging the crown prince not to breathe a word of it to his grandfather. Finally, the crown prince returned to the matter at hand. Just as he was about to inquire about the progress of the task, Qin Dong outside the door caught their attention. Hearing the noise from outside, the crown prince whipped around. "Someone's eavesdropping! You impudent scoundrel! Show yourself!" he roared. Nan Gongzi started towards the door. Realizing she'd been discovered, Qin Dong panicked. Before she could flee, Nan Gongzi flung the door open. Caught off guard, Qin Dong stumbled, landing in a heap at the feet of the crown prince and Nan Gongzi. The scene was undeniably awkward. Faced with this predicament, Qin Dong could only feign composure. Seeing his beloved consort unexpectedly arrive, the usually unflappable crown prince couldn't help but be intrigued. Qin Dong, of course, couldn't very well admit she'd been eavesdropping outside his door, seeking revenge for the stolen kiss earlier that day. So, she concocted a story about being worried about him falling into the koi pond and wanting to bring him a bowl of ginger soup. The crown prince hastily declined. After all, the last tonic she'd given him had nearly cost him his life. Thanks to his recent training regimen, the crown prince was now in excellent physical condition. He was also deeply suspicious that the mischievous Qin Dong might have laced the ginger soup with arsenic. Without a second thought, the crown prince made up an excuse to send Qin Dong away. But she wasn't one to be easily dismissed. Seeing his consort about to solicitously check on his health, the crown prince swiftly dodged her advance. Seeing his resistance, Qin Dong decided not to push the matter. After all, she had been caught eavesdropping. Having seized this opportunity, it was best to make a quick escape. Late into the night, laughter erupted from the crown prince's study. Seeing the crown prince so flustered by Qin Dong, Ningongzi couldn't resist teasing him again. The crown prince of Qi, reduced to such a comical state by a mere slip of a girl. Outside, Qin Dong was sneaking back to her quarters. After all the commotion, she'd completely forgotten her original intention of avenging her stolen kiss. But since she couldn't recall, she decided not to dwell on it. The next morning arrived. Accompanied by the sounds of punches and kicks, Qin Dong's martial arts skills were almost fully restored. Just then, Chuan Xia, her maid, informed her that the crown prince's wet nurse had summoned her to the main hall. The reason for the summons was the arrival of the renowned beauty the wet nurse had mentioned earlier, Miss Yuan, who had arrived at the crown prince's residence. Qin Dong hurried back to her room to bathe and change. If it hadn't been for this sudden reminder, she would have completely forgotten about this impending trouble. The legendary beauty of Qi, Yuan Zixian, must be the embroidery tutor the wet nurse had arranged. Yuan Zixian's arrival confirmed Qin Dong's suspicion that the wet nurse would use this opportunity to find fault with her. Fortunately, Qin Dong wasn't easily intimidated. Having read countless palace intrigue novels in her past life, dealing with a mere wet nurse was child's play. Brave consort, unafraid of challenges. The next moment, Qin Dong steeled herself to face her fears. And indeed, Yuan Zixian was a breathtaking beauty. The wet nurse began to find fault with Qin Dong. The more she observed them together, the more charming the renowned beauty of Qi appeared. In comparison, Qin Dong seemed rather unrefined. Therefore, the wet nurse insisted that Qin Dong not only learn embroidery, but also proper etiquette from Yuan Zixian. Qin Dong was extremely resistant. However, at this point, for the sake of appearances, she couldn't refuse outright. And so, beginning that day, the crown princess began her arduous embroidery lessons. Qin Dong could only hope she wouldn't drive Miss Yuan to tears in the coming days. Late that night, Yuan Zixian, being a lady of noble birth, couldn't have possibly come to the crown prince's residence simply to teach needlework. Rumors had spread that the crown princess was both ugly and dim-witted. Having met her, Yuan Zixian saw that the rumors were baseless. Her purpose in coming to the crown prince's residence was simple. She intended to replace Qin Yidong and become the new crown princess by getting close to the crown prince. Another night passed. Meanwhile, Qin Yidong tossed and turned in her bed. From tomorrow onwards, her carefree days would be over. But even as the crown princess, she couldn't refuse the impending embroidery lessons. I might have escaped the first day, but I can't avoid the 15th, Qin Yidong muttered through gritted teeth. Yuan Zixian's embroidery skills were renowned throughout the kingdom, and this upcoming lesson was sure to attract a great deal of attention. It was all the crown prince's fault, she fumed. If that scoundrel hadn't forced her into this marriage, she wouldn't have to endure this torture. As if summoned by her disgruntled words, the crown prince's voice drifted in from just outside the door. Qin Yidong's heart plummeted. This was it. She was done for. Cursing the crown prince behind his back, only to be caught red-handed? Given the strict feudal customs of this era, publicly insulting the crown prince was practically a death sentence. And the crown prince, standing in the doorway, seemed to relish the moment, affecting an air of righteous indignation. Quick as a flash, Qin Yidong's mind raced, concocting a desperate, if improbable, explanation. "Your Highness, you don't understand our local dialect," she blurted out, feigning innocence. "Where I come from, scoundrel actually means I love you." The crown prince blinked, clearly bewildered by this bizarre declaration. Beside him, a young eunuch struggled to suppress a giggle. Undeterred by the blatant absurdity of her lie, Qin Yidong nodded emphatically. "It's true. My love for your highness runs so deep." The crown prince, playing along with her charade, replied with mock seriousness, "I see. So your love for me is truly scoundrelly." Seizing the opportunity to change the subject, Qin Yidong wondered what had brought the crown prince to her quarters, a rare occurrence indeed. She desperately wanted him to leave. The crown prince finally revealed his purpose. He had heard about the wet nurse arranging for Qin Yidong to meet with Yuan Zixian and, worried that she might be bullied, had come to check on her. Qin Yidong was taken aback. The crown prince, showing concern for her? There had to be a catch. Suspicious, she decided to take action. Qin Yidong hopped out of bed. The crown prince, mistaking her sudden approach for affection, leaned in expectantly. But before he could get too close, Qin Yidong unleashed a barrage of tickles. When that failed to deter him, she resorted to more forceful measures. With a final shove, she propelled the future emperor out of her room. "This girl is impossible," he muttered. The door slammed shut, leaving the crown prince fuming. However, seeing Qin Yidong's spirited resistance, he felt reassured. A girl that feisty wouldn't be easily bullied. With his worries eased, he turned to leave. Meanwhile, Qin Yidong was clumsily attempting to master the art of embroidery under Yuan Zixian's tutelage. Despite her repeated pleas, Yuan Zixian refused to give up on teaching her. Just then, footsteps approached. The crown prince strolled past their window, seemingly unaware of their presence. Upon seeing him, Yuan Zixian, who harbored ambitions of becoming the crown princess, instantly transformed. Her demeanor shifted dramatically, becoming 800 times more gentle and demure, eager to impress the crown prince with her virtuous nature. Qin Yidong watched with growing annoyance. This woman was just like the wet nurse, stubbornly refusing to listen to reason. But appearances can be deceiving, and Qin Yidong was still oblivious to the true intentions hidden within the heart of Qi's most beautiful woman. As the two women continued their lesson, each with their own hidden agendas, Qin Yidong pricked her finger with the embroidery needle. A sharp sting shot through her fingertip, and a small bead of blood welled up. Hearing the cry from within, the crown prince, who had been pretending to pass by, swiftly entered the room. A charming smile played on his lips. Qin Yidong, startled by his sudden appearance, watched as he rushed to her side, his face etched with concern. Confused, she could only stare as he gently grasped her wrist. "Oh dear, my wife, how clumsy of you. Your finger is bleeding. Someone, call the royal physician." Qin Dong felt a blush creep up her cheeks. It's just a small scratch, Your Highness. There's no need for a physician. But the Crown Prince was adamant. A scratch is still an injury. You may not be Lin Daiyu, but what if you lose too much blood? Yuan Zixian, observing this tender display of affection, seethed with jealousy. She desperately desired the position of Crown Princess. Seeing Qin Dong so favored, Yuan Zixian felt a surge of anger. She took out a silver needle and pricked her own finger. Immediately following, a soft, no, pitiful cry escaped her lips. Not far away, Qin Dong saw Yuan Zixian deliberately injure herself and couldn't help but feel extremely irritated. But in the next moment, he was stunned by Yuan Zixian's delicate and vulnerable appearance. She truly was a lotus-like beauty. Yet, for some unknown reason, the Crown Prince showed no concern for Yuan Zixian. Instead, he seemed more worried about Qin Dong's injured finger. In no time at all, the imperial physician hurried over. As a physician, he possessed considerable professional ethics. The Crown Prince, standing beside them, pulled Qin Dong forward for examination. The moment the physician saw the extent of Qin Dong's injury, he couldn't help but be shocked. Such a serious injury. Fortunately, she sought medical attention promptly. If it had been any later, the wound would have healed itself. Amidst this comical scene, Yuan Zixian's face turned a ghastly green. Suddenly, her maid noticed something was amiss. Yuan Zixian looked down at her pricked finger. A gush of blood spurted out. Oh my goodness, she thought. It was just a needle prick. How could so much blood come out? Immediately after, cries of "Miss Yuan has fainted from blood loss" echoed throughout the Crown Prince's residence. Time passed. Yuan Zixian lay injured in bed. The Crown Prince's wet nurse, upon hearing the news, rushed over and anxiously examined Yuan Zixian's injury. Yuan Zixian could only feign composure. After all, she had deliberately caused this herself. Even if she suffered excessive blood loss, she couldn't blame anyone else. The wet nurse, living up to her reputation for being hard-hearted, saw Yuan Zixian's nonchalance, and her expression immediately changed. She instructed Yuan Zixian to take better care of Qin Dong from now on. But the wet nurse wasn't entirely heartless. She prepared some blood-enriching medicinal cuisine for Yuan Zixian to help her recover. As the wet nurse left, Yuan Zixian quickly questioned her maid. While I was unconscious, did the Crown Prince personally carry me back to my room? The maid quickly shook her head in denial. The Crown Prince hadn't shown much concern for Yuan Zixian's injury. All his attention was focused on Qin Dong. He even managed to remain indifferent to the fainting of Qi's most beautiful woman. Because of this, Yuan Zixian became determined to find a way to drive a wedge between the Crown Prince and his wife. Night fell. Qin Dong was being severely scolded by her personal maid. As a Crown Princess, how dare she address the Crown Prince by his name? This was a grave offense. Qin Dong, however, remained unconcerned. She almost wished the Crown Prince would chop off her head. So, in the next moment, Qin Dong stormed into the Crown Prince's room to confront him. Seeing this, the Crown Prince remained calm. He had merely shown concern for his wife during the day. Was it a crime? Qin Dong grew angrier the more she thought about it. It was just a bruised finger. It wasn't necessary to wrap it up like a dumpling. Besides, that Liang Xian was incredibly cunning. For no apparent reason, he had come to check on her. Such strange behavior. That boy definitely had ulterior motives. The Crown Prince put on a wronged expression. He had shown kindness and concern for this woman, only to be met with accusations. Women truly were unpredictable. Qin Dong scowled. The Crown Prince's behavior was so suspicious. He must have some other motive. After all, there's no such thing as a free lunch. If he had any requests, he might as well just say them. Anything she could help with, she certainly would. Hearing this, the Crown Prince suddenly pursed his lips. The next moment, he burst into laughter, facing Qin Dong. Qin Dong was taken aback. The Crown Prince, with a look of affection, ruffled Qin Dong's hair. This little girl was truly adorable. As the Crown Prince, second only to the Emperor, even if he had something to ask, would he really need help from a little girl like her? Or was this little girl actually trying to offer herself to him? Looking at the handsome man before her, Qin Dong's face flushed crimson. "You idiot! What are you thinking?" she retorted. "I don't have any ulterior motives." The two began to bicker flirtatiously, without any restraint. Their maid watched on, amused by their interaction. The next day, Qin Dong was practicing embroidery in her room, but her mind but all she could see was the crown prince's indulgent face from yesterday. Qin Yidong had lived for so long, yet this was the first time a man had patted her head. That scoundrel of a crown prince was truly infuriating. However, in all her life, he was also the first man to call her cute. Qin Yidong's thoughts began to wander. Such bizarre behavior also caught the attention of Yuan Zixian, who was standing nearby. Yuan Zixian thought Qin Yidong was unwell and immediately prepared to call for a physician. Qin Yidong quickly declined with a smile. The two women appeared respectful, but then Yuan Zixian abruptly changed the subject. Before coming to the crown prince's residence, she had meticulously prepared a gift for Qin Yidong. A servant girl carried a silk robe into the room. It turned out that Yuan Zixian had personally sewn the garment for Qin Yidong, although it wasn't as exquisite as the brocades found outside the palace. It was made by the hands of the renowned beauty, making it quite valuable. Qin Yidong regarded the robe thoughtfully. Although Yuan Zixian appeared amiable, Qin Yidong couldn't shake the memory of her lotus-like act from the previous day. She suspected something was amiss with the robe. Seeing Qin Yidong hesitate to accept it, Yuan Zixian put on her innocent act once more. Qin Yidong could only play along. Such exquisite workmanship. I'm almost too afraid to wear it. Yuan Zixian, with a sly smile, urged Qin Yidong to try on the new robe. Such eagerness aroused Qin Yidong's suspicion. But to avoid alerting Yuan Zixian, she outwardly complied. I need to think of a way to get out of this. Behind a folding screen, Qin Yidong looked around frantically. Suddenly, an idea struck her. She grabbed a pair of scissors from the table and began to furiously shred the strange robe. Outside the screen, the mistress and servant, believing their scheme was about to succeed, finally revealed their sinister expressions. It turned out that Yuan Zixian had laced the robe with a potent poison. Simply wearing it would ruin the wearer's appearance. If Qin Yidong's face were disfigured, the position of crown princess would become vacant. Suddenly, a scream came from behind the screen. The pair excitedly assumed the poison had taken effect and rushed behind the screen, feigning concern for Qin Yidong. But strangely, Qin Yidong was not only unharmed, but she was also holding up the damaged robe, demanding an explanation. What kind of shoddy robe did you make for me? Not only does it not fit, but it's also full of holes. Yuan Zixian was utterly flustered. She had been so meticulous. Yet how could such a mistake occur? Qin Yidong seized the opportunity and accused Yuan Zixian of deliberately humiliating her because she didn't want to teach her embroidery. Yuan Zixian stammered to explain. Just then, hurried footsteps approached. The crown prince passed by their window again. Yuan Zixian panicked. In her desperation, she dramatically collapsed to the floor, feigning unconsciousness. Her servant girl was terrified. What kind of performance is this? One moment she's putting on a show, and the next she's fainted. Qin Yidong was baffled. Just then, the seasoned actress opened her eyes and subtly gestured to her servant. The maid instantly understood her mistress's meaning. She turned and ran out the door, straight to the crown prince, to tearfully relay a fabricated account, placing all the blame on Qin Yidong, the crown princess. The crown prince was instantly worried, but not for Yuan Zixian. Seeing the crown prince arrive, Qin Yidong was startled. With Yuan Zixian still pretending to be unconscious, Qin Yidong finally understood the convenient timing of her collapse. It was all too perfectly orchestrated, but as luck would have it, the crown prince hadn't even glanced at Yuan Zixian. He had misheard the maid, thinking Qin Yidong was the one who had been harmed. He hadn't realized it was Yuan Zixian who had fainted. Just then, Yuan Zixian's maid stepped forward again to complain. Only then did the crown prince remember Yuan Zixian lying unconscious on the floor. So he quickly ordered Juyin to summon the imperial physician. Meanwhile, the servant girl beside them didn't miss the opportunity to viciously blame Qin Yidong. She embellished the previous incident between Qin Yidong and Yuan Zixian and reported it to the crown prince. And she insisted that Qin Yidong had harmed Yuan Zixian. Qin Yidong found herself in a predicament, unable to defend herself. She was clearly the one poisoned, yet somehow she was being accused of harming the other woman. Hearing this, the crown prince didn't panic. He wasn't quick to blame Qin Yidong. In the crown prince's mind, Yuan Zixian was someone so fragile she'd faint even from pinprick. He didn't believe, as the servant girl claimed, that she was robust and strong. Hearing this, Chin Yidong couldn't help but feel a secret surge of delight. Unexpectedly, the crown prince was quite astute, instantly transforming into a sharp-witted judge, his words logical and well-founded. He was rather charming like this. The crown prince, in turn, rebuked Yuan Zixin's servant girl, warning her that if she dared to slander the crown princess again, he wouldn't be lenient. With that, the crown prince turned to Chin Yidong and began discussing the evening meal. Chin Yidong felt incredibly awkward. This guy was suddenly acting so affectionate. Who was he trying to show off to? Meanwhile, Yuan Zixin was still lying unconscious on the floor. To avoid the crown prince's unexpected invitation, Chin Yidong immediately offered to personally carry Yuan Zixin back to her room. Both the crown prince and the servant girl froze in place. At that moment, Yuan Zixin opened her eyes. If she were to have such close contact with that woman, she'd rather die in the crown prince's residence. In the next instant, Yuan Zixin demonstrated what a true medical miracle looked like. After waking up, Yuan Zixin pretended as if nothing had happened. But her performance was far too obvious, hardly worthy of an award-winning actress. But did you think Yuan Zixin's performance would end there? Seeing the crown prince standing before her, Yuan Zixin, who had just moments ago seemed perfectly fine, suddenly felt dizzy again. With a delicate sway, she prepared to fall into the crown prince's arms. As long as she could have physical contact with the crown prince, the relationship between Chin Yidong and the crown prince was bound to fracture. But Yuan Zixin didn't expect the crown prince to be skilled in martial arts. With a casual sidestep, he dodged Yuan Zixin's aggressive lunge, sending the little schemer tumbling to the ground. Seeing that Yuan Zixin had recovered, the crown prince decided not to summon the imperial physician after all. He then grabbed Chin Yidong's hand, his brow furrowed, wanting to quickly escape the scene. Yuan Zixin's face turned livid. She hadn't expected her plan to fail yet again. Next, she would launch an even fiercer attack on Chin Yidong. Elsewhere, Crown Prince Liang Xian hurriedly pulled Chin Yidong to the riverside. He gazed affectionately at his beloved consort, making Chin Yidong blush. Regarding the incident that had just occurred, the crown prince was still bothered. After all, he had almost embraced Yuan Zixin. He was very concerned about whether Chin Yidong would be angry about it, but Chin Yidong appeared calm and indifferent. The distance between them grew smaller and smaller. Until the last moment, Chin Yidong simply averted her gaze from the crown prince. This seemingly insignificant act had consequences. With a gentle push, the crown prince lost his footing, whether intentionally or not. Before falling, the crown prince grabbed Chin Yidong's braid. The two of them tumbled together, plunging with a splash into the small river beside them. Two large splashes erupted on the calm water surface. Seeing this, the servant girl frantically called for help. After the rescue, a forcefully soaked Chin Yidong sneezed continuously in her room. That darn crown prince. It was bad enough that he fell into the water, but he had to drag her down with him. Seeing her mistress catch a cold, Chunxia hurriedly brought her medicine. But Chin Yidong nonchalantly declared that it was just a little dip in the water, nothing to worry about. Compared to her own regularly exercised, robust body, that darn Liang Xian was much more likely to get sick. After all, in just a few short days, the poor crown prince had already fallen into the water multiple times. Chunxia, hearing Chin Yidong address the crown prince so informally again, quickly urged her mistress to break this dangerous habit. Just then, Yuan Zixin's voice drifted in from outside. The saccharine schemer arrived, feigning concern. She inquired about Chin Yidong's health, and to further demonstrate her solicitude for the crown princess, the oh-so-kind Yuan Zixin brought 2 doses of medicine, specifically for treating wind and cold. Moreover, these remedies, she claimed, were certified by the imperial physician, guaranteed to cure any cold instantly. With that, Yuan Zixin instructed Chunxia to immediately brew the medicine and administer it to Chin Yidong. Bound by propriety, Chunxia could only comply. However, Chunxia was, after all, Chin Yidong's personal maid. Yuan Zixin, so casually ordering around the crown princess's servant, naturally made Chin Yidong uncomfortable. Seeing that Chin Yidong had accepted the medicine, Yuan Zixin wasted no more breath and turned to take her leave. The 2 doses of medicine she had gifted Chin Yidong contained far more than simple herbs. Their ingredients were sinister, the poison hidden so deep that its source would be untraceable. With a venomous smirk, Yuan Zixian's true, viperous nature briefly revealed itself. Elsewhere, the quick-witted Chuanxia, seeing the schemer depart, quietly emerged from the shadows. She had not followed Yuan Zixian's instructions to brew the poison. Qin Yidong turned and ordered Chuanxia to discard the medicine. While Chuanxia had obeyed, she had been completely unaware of the danger. Learning that the medicine was poisoned, her face drained of color. Such unprovoked generosity had to conceal ulterior motives. Yuan Zixian saw Qin Yidong as a rival for the crown prince's affections and would never offer her medicine out of genuine concern. In the courtyard, the maids Ahe and Danxin worried that their mistress's schemes would lead to someone's death within the crown prince's residence. Yuan Zixian, however, remained confident. The medicine she had sent wouldn't be fatal. Nevertheless, its effects were potent. 2 rats, having ingested the concoction, became violently agitated. The astute Qin Yidong had already begun her own experiments with the help of some small test subjects. Judging by the current results, leaving Yuan Zixian unchecked would undoubtedly lead to trouble. Yet, despite Yuan Zixian's blatant machinations, Liang Xian hadn't expelled her from the residence. Qin Yidong couldn't fathom the crown prince's intentions. Since Liang Xian hadn't acted, Qin Yidong decided to observe further. She was curious to see what Yuan Zixian would do next. Time passed quickly. Qin Yidong was jogging in the garden when she happened upon the scheming Yuan Zixian. Hoping to lure her into revealing her hand, Qin Yidong approached and thanked her for the medicine. Seeing Qin Yidong alive and well, Yuan Zixian maintained a pleasant facade while inwardly seething with frustration. Had something gone wrong with her poison? Yuan Zixian resolved to investigate. Back in her quarters, Yuan Zixian retrieved the poison. With a cruel glint in her eye, she summoned her personal maid and ordered Ahe to consume it. If Ahe showed no reaction, then the medicine must have been tampered with. If there was no effect, it would prove that Qin Yidong hadn't taken the poison at all. Ahe's face darkened. Yuan Zixian fell into deep thought, a chilling silence descending upon the room. Meanwhile, Qin Yidong, still jogging, was startled by a sudden scream. It sounded like Yuan Zixian. Although Qin Yidong preferred to avoid entanglement, Yuan Zixian was a guest in the residence, and ignoring the situation could lead to serious consequences. Qin Yidong decided to fetch the crown prince and investigate together. A horrifying scene awaited them. Ahe, now resembling a crazed zombie after ingesting the poison, had pinned her mistress to the ground and was attempting to strangle her. Just as Ahe was about to deliver the final blow, Qin Yidong and the crown prince arrived. Seizing the opportunity, Yuan Zixian, with a sudden burst of strength, broke free and lunged towards the crown prince. Right in front of Qin Yidong, Yuan Zixian clung tightly to the crown prince. Qin Yidong was stunned by Yuan Zixian's dramatic performance. Seeing her prey escape, Ahe turned and lunged towards Yuan Zixian once more. Thankfully, Zhuiying was quick-witted and nimble. As the crown prince's personal eunuch and guard, he swiftly backhanded Ahe, knocking her unconscious to the ground. The immediate trouble was resolved. However, Yuan Zixian, that shameless woman, continued to cling tightly to the crown prince. Ahe's frenzied attack had left a large handprint on Yuan Zixian. At that moment, Qin Yidong, as if her brain had short-circuited, astonishingly suggested that the crown prince carry Yuan Zixian back to her room to rest. Qin Yidong, do you know what you're saying? The crown prince asked repeatedly for confirmation. Qin Yidong remained firm. This woman's level of manipulation was truly unfathomable. Despite this, the crown prince continued to demur. But Qin Yidong wasn't being foolish. By having the crown prince carry Yuan Zixian, she was looking for an opportunity to deal with this play-acting White Lotus. By making the suggestion herself, the rest depended on the crown prince's understanding. The crown prince again sought confirmation of Qin Yidong's seemingly unreasonable request. Qin Yidong expressed her complete agreement. After all, she said, saving someone is paramount. Your Highness needn't concern yourself with my feelings. Hearing this, the crown prince scoffed and, right in front of his beloved consort, scooped Yuan Zixian into his arms. Qin Yidong secretly rejoiced at this sight, while Chuanxia, standing beside her, was sweating with anxiety. The next day arrived. After Yuan Zixian's theatrics the previous day, the crown prince's residence enjoyed a rare moment of peace. The bad news was that Liang Xian, usually utterly devoted to his crown princess, had spent the entire day in Yuan Zixian's room. This was unlike him. Qin Yidong couldn't help but wonder. Had they developed feelings for each other? Had the crown prince truly fallen for Yuan Zixian? No, the crown prince would never do such a thing. After all, Yuan Zixian's manipulative nature was glaringly obvious. Even if Liang Xian didn't love her, he would never get involved with someone like Yuan Zixian. Determined to unravel the mystery, Qin Yidong decided to investigate the situation herself. Seeing the crown princess's hurried departure, Chunxia was thrilled. She thought her mistress had finally come to her senses. The two quickly entered the room. The crown prince and Yuan Zixian were engaged in a tender scene. Witnessing this, mistress and servant froze in place, utterly awkward. Not far away, Yuan Zixian, never one to miss an opportunity, played the innocent card with the crown prince. While feigning concern for disrupting the crown prince's marriage, she secretly relished the thought of their separation. Qin Yidong felt a wave of nausea. She had originally prepared a tonic for Yuan Zixian, intending to deliver it personally, but now she had lost all interest. After a brief instruction to Chunxia, she quickly left. Watching this unfold, Yuan Zixian smirked to herself. 3 days later, Qin Yidong sat by the river, sighing. Since that day, the crown prince had become like a different person. He doted on Yuan Zixian and treated Qin Yidong with icy indifference. Given Liang Xian's intelligence, how could he fall for such a manipulative woman? Qin Yidong was tormented by conflicting emotions. It was she who had encouraged Liang Xian to get close to Yuan Zixian. Yet now she felt a deep unease. Was she truly? Just as Qin Yidong was lost in her troubled thoughts, Yuan Zixian's voice broke through her reverie. The first thing Yuan Zixian did upon arriving was to flaunt the crown prince's attentive care over the past few days. After all, she purred, to have the current crown prince personally serve porridge. Even the crown princess hasn't received such devotion, have you? A flicker of anger flashed through Qin Yidong. It's a pity Miss Yuan isn't the crown princess. Instead of being offended, Yuan Zixian openly taunted Qin Yidong. How much longer do you think you'll hold onto that title? With Yuan Zixian's open provocation, Qin Yidong abandoned all pretense of politeness. If Miss Yuan weren't a guest in the residence, the crown prince wouldn't give you a second glance. Yuan Zixian let out a cold laugh. Even if I'm not the crown princess, hasn't the crown prince treated you with utter indifference these past few days? Qin Yidong felt a sharp pang of pain. Yuan Zixian, growing bolder, continued her attack. She confessed to tampering with Qin Yidong's clothes and threatened to tell the crown prince about the day Qin Yidong knocked her unconscious. Qin Yidong remained unfazed. Unbeknownst to them, the crown prince himself had been observing their confrontation from a distance. Yuan Zixian, never one to back down, seeing her taunts having little effect, resorted to using Qin Yidong's father as leverage. Qin Yidong's fury ignited at Yuan Zixian's words. If Yuan Zixian fabricated some scandal, given her family's influence, Qin Yidong's father's position would be precarious. Rage consumed her. She grabbed Yuan Zixian by the collar. She could tolerate Yuan Zixian's scheming within the residence. She could even tolerate insults directed at herself. But she would absolutely not allow this vile woman to threaten her family. From a distance, the crown prince, Liang Xian, watched the two women locked in their bitter, escalating quarrel. Their voices grew sharper, their accusations more pointed. Yuan Zixian shoved Qin Yidong away. In a calculated move to frame her rival, she feigned a stumble, her body pitching towards a nearby pond. Her dramatic cry, however, led those around them to believe Qin Yidong had pushed her. Qin Yidong, momentarily stunned, watched in disbelief. The crown prince's expression shifted. Alarm etched across his face. He immediately ordered someone to rescue Yuan Zixian. Yuan Zixian thrashed in the water, crying out for help. The crown prince strode towards Qin Yidong. She had hoped his intelligence would lead him to the truth. Instead, to her outrage, he immediately accused her. Qin Yidong's anger surged. The crown prince insisted that Qin Yidong had deliberately pushed Yuan Zixian into the pond. This was the final straw. In front of everyone, Qin Yidong unleashed a torrent of furious words, pointing directly at the crown prince. Seeing the conflict erupt, Yuan Zixian, feigning innocence, stepped forward to mediate. She even spoke up in Qin Yidong's defense, a picture of gentle concern. But the crown prince, as heir to the throne, could not tolerate such public humiliation. Liang Xian's fury was palpable. Yuan Zixian, with a carefully crafted air of detachment, subtly fanned the flames of their argument. Finally, Qin Yidong's control snapped. Fine. You say I pushed this little viper into the pond. I admit, I didn't touch her before. But since you insist, it seems rude not to oblige. With a resounding splash, just as Yuan Zixian was being helped from the water, Qin Yidong, with a swift, practiced move, flipped her over her shoulder and sent her tumbling back into the pond. Turning to glare at the crown prince, she seethed, I wasn't guilty before, but thanks to you, I am now. I thank your ancestors 8 generations back. You've made sure of that. Qin Yidong grabbed the crown prince by the shoulders. Another heave, and to the astonishment of the onlookers, she tossed him into the water as well. The crown prince was utterly stunned. Qin Yidong's face remained a mask of fury. She had thought Liang Xian was intelligent enough to see through Yuan Zixian's manipulations. Instead, he was blinded by her beauty. Not only that, but he sided with an outsider against his own wife. It was Yuan Zixian who was threatening to use her family's influence to harm Qin Yidong's father. Yet the crown prince had chosen to believe her lies. The crown prince's eyes widened in realization. Yuan Zixian, quick to defend herself, rushed to explain, desperate to avoid suspicion. She downplayed her family's influence, painting them as practically powerless, a stark contrast to her earlier threats. Just moments ago, when first thrown into the water, she had acted the part of a fragile, helpless victim. Now soaked for the second time, she was remarkably composed. The crown prince was quickly pulled from the pond. As Qin Yidong turned to leave, he called out, stopping her. Her face darkened. She almost wished he would order her execution. The crown prince sighed inwardly. Despite his outward anger, he still cared for Qin Yidong. He decided on a light punishment, removing her from the public eye, giving them both time to cool down. Qin Yidong stormed off. The crown prince, mindful of the Yuan family's reputation, refrained from openly reprimanding Yuan Zixian. Once the commotion subsided, the crown prince was left alone with his thoughts. The incident had spiraled out of control. He had intended to stage a scene with Qin Yidong, but events had taken an unexpected turn. The damage was done. To appease the onlookers, he had been forced to punish Qin Yidong. Elsewhere, the assassin he had hired had made all the necessary arrangements. The crown prince smiled. His words, however, the assassin, Yama, was utterly dumbfounded. To prevent any further mishaps with Qin Yidong, the crown prince decided to assign Yama as Qin Yidong's personal guard. Yama vehemently refused. Compared to babysitting the crown princess, killing was a far less daunting task. The next day, Qin Yidong, confined to her room, was startled awake by a commotion. After yesterday's incident, the Empress Dowager ordered the crown prince to divorce Qin Yidong. Hearing this, Qin Yidong was overjoyed. All the deliberate chaos she'd caused had finally paid off. The day of her divorce had arrived. Chunxia, however, was deeply worried. Yesterday's events had caused quite a stir. Who knew how many people in the residence were secretly mocking Qin Yidong behind her back? Chunxia urged her to relent, to avoid the humiliation of being divorced. Qin Yidong silently rose. Mistaking her action, Chunxia assumed she'd agreed to apologize to the crown prince. Meanwhile, the crown prince, hearing that his beloved wife intended to apologize, was ecstatic. This was unheard of. He suspected this wasn't an apology, but another elaborate scheme to torment him. Just then a knock echoed. So, even this woman had moments of trepidation. Qin Yidong's expression was solemn. Her maid, praying her mistress wouldn't be divorced, silently pleaded with the heavens. The crown prince watched Qin Yidong's performance. She extended her hand. Believing his wife was finally relenting, the crown prince assumed she wanted to shake hands and make amends. What followed was a truly dramatic scene. Qin Yidong's expression shifted. Your Highness, she declared, I am not offering my hand in reconciliation. I am here for my divorce papers. Everyone was stunned. The crown prince was taken aback. Had she lost her mind? To come all this way just to demand a divorce? His composure shattered. He roared at Qin Yidong. It was all an act. Even if the Empress Dowager commands it, how could I ever divorce you? Seeing him hesitate, Qin Yidong grew impatient. The assassin and the maids were suffocating under the heavy atmosphere. The crown prince, his face dark, dragged Qin Yidong out. Originally confined for 3 days, her demand for a divorce had extended her punishment to half a month. He threw her out of the room. Furious, Qin Yidong kicked the study door. but she seemed to have forgotten her restored superhuman strength. With just a few kicks, the door to the Crown Prince's study collapsed. The Crown Prince was livid. Yet, he couldn't bring himself to be angry with his beloved. He redirected his fury towards his subordinates. Yama, the assassin, was near tears. Why was he always the one who suffered? Meanwhile, Yuan Zixian and her maid were delighted to hear of Qin Yidong's latest outburst. Qin Yidong's days were surely numbered. She'd barely settled in and had already turned the Crown Prince's residence upside down. Qin Yidong didn't deserve to be Crown Princess. Yuan Zixian decided to fan the flames. Qin Yidong had sent her some tonics a few days ago, and it was time to use them to send Qin Yidong to her grave. As the saying goes, a woman's downfall can happen in an instant. Because she'd broken the door to the Crown Prince's study, Qin Yidong was punished again by the Empress Dowager. Confined to her quarters, she was ordered to copy hundreds of scriptures daily. The Empress Dowager claimed it would purify both Qin Yidong and the Crown Prince's souls. In reality, it was agonizing torture, but she couldn't defy the Empress Dowager. Resigned, the pitiful Qin Yidong continued copying the endless scriptures. Just then, Chunxia rushed in. In a single day, another major incident had erupted within the Crown Prince's residence. Yuan Zixian had been mysteriously poisoned overnight. Her maid vehemently insisted that her mistress had fallen ill after consuming the tonic Qin Yidong had sent a few days prior. Hearing this, Qin Yidong flew into a rage. That conniving viper! How dare she frame her like this? I've shown her restraint time and time again, but she dares to escalate things to this level. Qin Yidong thought furiously, rising to her feet. Just as she stepped out the door, she collided head-on with the Crown Prince. Qin Yidong's emotions were raw. Had he come to arrest her? Seeing her distressed expression, the Crown Prince's heart twisted within him. But Qin Yidong only misinterpreted his presence further. Consumed by indignation, she stormed towards the residence gates, intending to surrender herself to the authorities. The Crown Prince, startled, quickly caught up and stopped her. While Yuan Zixian's poisoning on the surface did seem to implicate Qin Yidong, and Yuan Zixian had repeatedly complained to him, it didn't mean he believed her lies. Seeing the Crown Prince's continued rationality, Qin Yidong was taken aback. So he hadn't brought his entourage with such a fierce demeanor to apprehend her, but to protect her from harm? In the Crown Prince's eyes, there was no Yuan Zixian. There was only his beloved Crown Princess, Qin Yidong. A blush crept up Qin Yidong's cheeks. He had been so quick to accuse her before. If he truly favored Yuan Zixian, why wouldn't he simply? That concubine was a complete wretch. Seeing Qin Yidong on the verge of tears, the Crown Prince pulled her into his arms. Silly girl, you're so gullible. I was only putting on an act. You actually believed it, he thought. A Crown Prince thrown into a pond in public, and she only gets 3 days of punishment? Does she truly not see through my intentions? She keeps telling me to find other women, so naturally, I had to retaliate a little. It was all a misunderstanding, a ruse to uncover the truth. That silly Qin Yidong, to damage their relationship over someone as insignificant as Yuan Zixian. She truly owed him some compensation. Meanwhile, Yuan Zixian, upon hearing the news of the Crown Prince and Princess's reconciliation, despite having been supposedly deathly ill just moments before, suddenly sprang up, ready to confront the Crown Prince. But her maid quickly restrained her. Yuan Zixian was bewildered. The Crown Prince had only sent a single message through her maid. A message that struck the self-proclaimed innocent Yuan Zixian like a bolt of lightning. The second prince was waiting for her at the Yuan family residence. The Crown Prince had long discovered her clandestine dealings with the second prince. Meanwhile, the Crown Prince was in excellent spirits. Qin Yidong, seeing the Crown Prince brazenly occupying her room, immediately tried to evict him. But in the next moment, the roguish Crown Prince, without warning, pulled the stunned girl into a kiss. Qin Yidong's face flushed crimson. But they were husband and wife, after all, and the Crown Prince's health had greatly improved these past few days. So, the Crown Prince made a small request of his beloved. It's time we consummated our marriage. He had barely finished speaking when his subordinate barged into the room, oblivious to the romantic tension. Yuan Zixian had been sent back to the Yuan family residence. Chini Dong was utterly astonished. From the looks of it, she had truly believed he intended to keep Yuan Zixian at the crown prince's residence as a concubine. However, the crown prince didn't want Chini Dong involved in the complexities of the situation. Moreover, the Yuan family's daughter was deeply favored in the palace. After this confrontation, Chini Dong would likely face further trouble, especially from the Empress Dowager, who might very well take action against her. If she wanted to remain safe, Chini Dong would have to cling tightly to the crown prince. And with that, Chini Dong embraced the crown prince before her. Meanwhile, Yuan Zixian returned to her family home as instructed by the crown prince. Hurrying from the carriage, she expected to find the second prince awaiting her, but instead, she was met by her elder brother. The second prince's supposed visit had been a ruse concocted by the crown prince, a thinly veiled warning to Yuan Zixian. Grasping the situation, Yuan Zixian immediately sought out the second prince. He, having heard of the events at the crown prince's residence, couldn't help but marvel at his elder brother's cunning. The crown prince had also issued a warning to the second prince, exploiting some leverage he held over him within the palace. All of this, it seemed, was for the sake of his new crown princess. After hearing all this, the second prince found himself intrigued by his new sister-in-law. A flower viewing banquet was to be held in the palace in 3 days' time, a perfect opportunity to meet her. Within the crown prince's residence, Chini Dong, upon hearing of the upcoming flower viewing banquet in 3 days, felt a familiar dread rising within her. This wasn't a simple Soyan flower viewing banquet. It was a blatant Hongmen banquet, a trap waiting to be sprung. Seeing his beloved's apprehension, the crown prince reassured her, invoking his own authority. With him by her side, no one in the palace would dare lay a hand on Chini Dong. Despite his assurances, Chini Dong remained uneasy. What have I done to deserve such a miserable fate? She lamented inwardly. 3 days passed quickly. Despite her attempts to reassure herself, Chini Dong couldn't shake her nervousness as she arrived at the grand hall. Soon, she would face the entire court's concubines and the formidable Empress Dowager. Just as her anxiety peaked, a warm hand clasped hers firmly. The crown prince leaned in, his gentle words calming her racing heart. Then, the eunuch announced the Empress Dowager's arrival. As crown princess, Chini Dong was the first to offer her respects. A solemn air filled the vast hall. To Chini Dong's surprise, Yuan Zixian was also present at the banquet. The crown prince and princess knelt before the Empress Dowager. This was the Empress Dowager's first encounter with Chini Dong since her marriage. The crown prince had shielded her for so long. Otherwise, she would have been summoned to the palace much sooner. The Empress Dowager then commanded Chini Dong to raise her head. Thankfully, she didn't rebuke her, merely complimenting her beauty before dismissing her to her seat. However, the matter wasn't so easily resolved. While the Empress Dowager hadn't been overly harsh, Yuan Zixian, standing beside her, seized the opportunity to fan the flames. After all, Chini Dong had caused quite a stir during the selection process. Fortunately, the crown prince intervened on Chini Dong's behalf. Their affectionate display eased the tension in the hall. But Yuan Zixian persisted audaciously, demanding, in front of the Empress Dowager, that Chini Dong perform a public display of brick-breaking with her bare hands. Finally, the crown prince had enough. I hear Miss Yuan is skilled in the arts of music, chess, calligraphy, and painting, he interjected. Perhaps Miss Yuan would grace us with a performance first. Hearing the crown prince's invitation, Yuan Zixian's spirits soared. She was determined to reclaim the position of crown princess. An awkward silence settled over the hall. With the crown prince's prompting, Yuan Zixian, before the assembled concubines, began to dance. Her movements were mesmerizing, her glances seductive. From the moment she began, her eyes never left the crown prince, a blatant provocation. With such a captivating performance, Yuan Zixian stole the show. Yet, the crown prince, in front of everyone, declared that her dance was only slightly better than that of a brothel girl. His words cut Yuan Zixian to the core. His verbal assault left her utterly humiliated. Only the Empress Dowager's intervention saved Yuan Zixian from further disgrace. The Crown Prince's actions served as a clear message to Yuan Zixian. Qin Dong was someone she should never cross. A tense calm settled over the hall. Perhaps to appear impartial, the Empress Dowager also wanted to see what talents Qin Dong could display. This piqued the Crown Prince's interest. He declared that his beloved consort was highly accomplished, proficient in the arts of zither, chess, calligraphy, and painting. Not only that, but her singing voice was also exceptionally moving. Qin Dong now found herself in a precarious position. Seeing her granddaughter-in-law's purported multifaceted talents, the Empress Dowager desired to be entertained at once. Left with no choice, Qin Dong agreed. The onlookers watched with anticipation as Qin Dong, with focused determination, lifted her incredibly long legs and, before the Empress Dowager, began to perform her signature flying kick. Grappling, tumbling, and various other acrobatic maneuvers blossomed forth. Such a performance made the Empress Dowager's face harden. Qin Dong's display was unprecedented in the entire history of the Imperial Palace. The Empress Dowager was deeply offended. Witnessing this scene, Yuan Zixian couldn't resist adding insult to injury, openly mocking Qin Dong. But Qin Dong's spirit wouldn't be cowed by this little viper. After all, she retorted, dances under heaven are myriad and diverse, each with its own unique charm. Just because you haven't seen it doesn't mean it's not art. If this is cause for ridicule, it only shows Miss Yuan's lack of worldliness. So narrow-minded, how dare you criticize others publicly? Tension filled the air once more. The Empress Dowager quickly ordered Qin Dong to withdraw. Although Qin Dong hadn't been entirely defeated in this confrontation, her dance was certainly less graceful than the mainstream styles. The Crown Prince, his motives unclear, seeing the Empress Dowager's fixation on Qin Dong's talents, simply proposed that Qin Dong remain in the palace to study dance under the Empress Dowager's tutelage. Qin Dong frowned at this suggestion, but the Empress Dowager readily approved. After all, the Empress Dowager was quite lonely in the palace. Keeping a granddaughter-in-law by her side would certainly make life more interesting. Seeing Qin Dong once again in favor, Yuan Zixian's face contorted with fury. Qin Dong, however, was in tears at being left alone in the palace. Seeing this, the Crown Prince moved to comfort her. Just then, a cheer interrupted their intimate moment. It was the second prince arriving. The second prince was a beloved figure throughout the palace and even the court, especially since his mother was the current reigning concubine, holding a position of power within the royal family, even surpassing Liang Xian, the crown prince, in influence. As they spoke, this most favored prince walked directly towards Qin Dong and the crown prince. So this is the legendary brick-smashing crown princess. Sensing his younger brother's hostility, Liang Xian quickly countered, if second brother is here solely to witness brick-smashing, today is Kongpar, not the right time. After all, my wife is not a circus monkey. The second prince's expression remained unchanged as he looked at the seemingly affectionate couple before him. They were quite different from the rumors. After all, the crown princess had personally thrown her beloved husband into the river. It seems the crown princess is even more interesting than I imagined, he remarked, then slowly turned to leave. Qin Dong noticed the clear dislike and resentment Liang Xian harbored for his brother. The crown prince didn't wish to elaborate on their complicated history. His priority was ensuring Qin Dong's survival within the palace walls. It was like throwing a little rabbit into a wolf's den. As night fell, Qin Dong, forcibly confined to the palace, cursed Liang Xian's foolish actions. How could that damn crown prince even think of sending his wife into the palace like this? It's like deliberately exposing a weakness, leaving her vulnerable to those with malicious intent. Now, surrounded by hidden dangers, Qin Dong constantly had to consider her own survival. A moment later, Chunxiao returned to the room, fuming. The servants in this palace are utterly heartless. Just now, Chunxiao was merely fetching some hot water when the palace servants heaped insults upon her, clearly showing no respect for the crown princess. Hearing this, Qin Dong fell into deep thought. There had to be more to it than met the eye. Late that night, Yuan Zixin knelt heavily on the floor. Her mission to infiltrate the crown prince's residence had failed. Now, with leverage against her in the hands of others, Yuan Zixin had effectively placed the lives of her entire family, hundreds of people young and old, in the second prince's hands. The grand scheme to seize power was gradually unfolding. If the second prince lost to the crown prince, numerous officials in Liang Xian's court, along with Yuan Zixin's entire family, would be buried with him. To ensure the smooth execution of his plan, the second prince tossed a vial of unknown liquid onto the floor, ordering Yuan Zixin to make sure Qin Yidong consumed it. Seeing this, a sinister thought crossed Yuan Zixin's mind. Since the crown princess held such significance for Liang Xian, she would be transformed into the second prince's pawn. As long as Qin Yidong ingested this mind-controlling poison, she would become a puppet in the second prince's hands. The thought of Liang Xian being betrayed by the woman he loved most brought an anticipatory smile to the second prince's face. Early the next morning, Qin Yidong quickly stopped a passing palace maid, but the maid recoiled as if she were afraid. After some coaxing, the maid finally agreed to speak with Qin Yidong. It turned out the power within the palace had shifted entirely towards the second prince. Furthermore, due to his birth, the crown prince was already out of favor within the inner court. Therefore, everyone in the palace treated the crown prince and Qin Yidong with cold indifference. Even the lowliest servants, while ostensibly showing respect to the crown princess, dared to display open disgust. At this point, the maid urged Qin Yidong to leave the imperial city. But Qin Yidong was undaunted. More than her own mistreatment, she was concerned about why the crown prince was facing such coldness. The maid's face paled with fear at the question. What the crown princess asked was a taboo subject within the palace. In his childhood, the crown prince had been deeply favored. But after the empress suddenly disappeared one day, his privileged position had plummeted. And the empress's disappearance was a sinister mystery within the inner court. Therefore, the crown prince's parentage had become an unspoken taboo. Elsewhere, Yuan Zixin was plotting to poison Qin Yidong. If she failed to complete the second prince's task, Yuan Zixin would become a sacrificial lamb. Hearing this, the maid's face twisted into a malicious grin. Danger lurked everywhere. Oblivious to the plots swirling around her, Qin Yidong spent the entire day exploring the palace grounds. Upon returning to her room, she collapsed onto the floor, exhausted and famished. Although it was dinner time, Chuanxia was nowhere to be found, and no meal had been prepared for her. Just then, Chuanxia stormed back into the room, carrying a tray of food. Looking at the watery broth, and especially the stale, rock-hard banko, Chuanxia and Qin Yidong were instantly enraged. Don't mistake my kindness for weakness. Do they really think I'm a pushover? Already fuming, Qin Yidong stormed out of the room, determined to demand an explanation. In the imperial kitchen, the imperial chef and a matron were discussing Qin Yidong's dinner. She's an out-of-favor crown princess, after all. What trouble can she cause with just a title? Even if we feed her scraps, she wouldn't dare complain. In this inner court, an unfavored concubine is lower than a dog. Before the words had fully left her lips, a hard bantok flew through the air like a cannonball, striking the matron squarely in the face. Everyone gasped in shock as they cried out in alarm. Another muntob stuffed itself into the matron's open mouth. These dogs dare to call the crown princess a dog? Their arrogance knows no bounds. Seeing the crown princess arrive, the servants who had been so brazen just moments before, the servants nervously bowed to Qin Yidong. They hadn't expected the crown princess to actually appear in the imperial kitchen. A cold smile played on Qin Yidong's lips. The stale mantu in the servants' mouths were hard as rocks. But faced with the crown princess, they dared not utter a single complaint. Seeing this, Qin Yidong ordered them to eat every last crumb of the moldy, cold mantu. At her words, the nearby kitchen staff scrambled to their feet. They forcibly shoved the rock-hard food down the servants' throats. Qin Yidong watched the two with an icy gaze. She wanted to see just how delicious these leftovers, harder than bricks, truly were. News of the crown princess's outburst in the imperial kitchen reached the second prince's ears. This crown princess, barely in the palace, was already causing such a commotion, creating such a scene over a meal. If she wasn't a fool, then perhaps she was hiding something. As night fell, the crown prince, Liang Xian, heard of the day's events. He hurried to Qin Yidong's room to see just how much his little wife had suffered. Look at this sneaky little miss, sneaking into the imperial kitchen in the dead of night, grumbling and complaining about the terrible life the crown prince had forced upon her. Little did she know, the crown prince, worried about his beloved consort, was already perched on the roof. Seeing his little wife still had the energy to complain, the crown prince's anxieties eased. Qin Yidong, feeling guilty, glanced around nervously. Ravenous, she searched for a while, and only found some leftover pastries. Leftovers in the imperial kitchen? Something wasn't right. This food must be poisoned. Qin Yidong was instantly on high alert. Driven by hunger, she resigned herself to eating them. Suddenly, a small chicken in the corner of the kitchen caught the crown princess's eye. Moments later, the poor chicken vanished without a trace. The crown prince silently observed Qin Yidong's actions. Suddenly, a noise echoed from afar. Qin Yidong also noticed the newcomer. It was the second prince himself. In the dead of night, the two met again in such a manner. If word got out that the crown princess was stealing chickens in the imperial kitchen in the middle of the night, wouldn't the crown prince and princess lose all face? But the second prince clearly underestimated Qin Yidong. This small matter wasn't enough to threaten her. The atmosphere between them grew tense. In truth, Qin Yidong's forced chicken thievery was thanks to the second prince. If it weren't for their rivalry, the crown princess wouldn't be treated with such disdain. Liang Xian watched the two fall silent. Just as the second prince was about to take Qin Yidong away, the crown prince, hidden on the rooftop, finally made his appearance. My goodness, over a single chicken, both princes revealed themselves. Truly a once-in-a-millennium spectacle. Qin Yidong could only sigh inwardly. Facing his troublesome younger brother, the crown prince went on full offense. With tensions rising, the second prince was the first to excuse himself. After all, this was the royal inner court. Arguing here with his elder brother, the crown prince wouldn't benefit him in the slightest. The crown prince looked at his beloved consort. Now that the crisis was averted, all that remained was playful banter. However, looking at the man who had heartlessly thrown her into the palace, Qin Yidong naturally wasn't in a good mood. If it weren't for this blasted man, she wouldn't have been reduced to stealing chicken wings in the middle of the night. The crown prince sighed inwardly. Qin Yidong was fuming, but in the next moment, the crown prince pulled her into a tight embrace. Qin Yidong froze, stunned. Then, the crown prince carried his beloved consort to the corner of the courtyard wall. He calmly walked to a ladder, preparing to escape over the wall with his beloved. They climbed the ladder onto the roof. Seeing the crown prince's secretive manner, Qin Yidong felt a shiver down her spine. Did he intend to do that with her on the roof? As they drew closer, Qin Yidong's heart pounded in her chest. Flustered, she quickly pulled away. That push nearly sent the esteemed crown prince tumbling off the roof. The tension between them gradually dissipated. Qin Yidong quietly looked at Liang Xian, wondering why he had come in the dead of night. Suddenly, the crown prince spoke, asking Qin Yidong if she wished to become empress one day. This abrupt change of topic left Qin Yidong utterly bewildered. But Liang Xian remained fixated on the question. Faced with this sudden inquiry, Qin Yidong instinctively refused. Crown Prince Liang Xian was perplexed. He hadn't imagined a woman in the world who wouldn't want to be empress. For Qin Yidong, however, becoming empress was no different from weaving a cocoon around herself. Despite this, the crown prince offered a faint smile. Whether or not she became empress wasn't entirely up to her. His words were immediately met with a swift punch. Since it's not up to me anyway, why even ask the question? Qin Yidong erupted. In the stillness of the night, the crown prince's cries echoed as his beloved consort pummeled him. Late that night, the crown prince escorted Qin Yidong back to her chambers. Even though she had admitted she didn't want to be empress, in his mind, she was the only possible choice. Liang Xian's eyes glinted. His plan was already in motion. What lay ahead was a brewing storm. The next day, Qin Yidong continued her torturous routine. Mastering the palace dances was no small feat, and these frivolous movements held no interest for her. She wondered when this agonizing training would finally end. Thankfully, the day offered a few precious moments of respite. Seizing the opportunity, Qin Yidong slipped out of her room. As fate would have it, she immediately bumped into the ghost-like second prince. The man seemed to enjoy loitering around the Eastern Palace. Not only that, but he also lurked in corners, eavesdropping on her conversations. He was truly lacking in manners. Seeing his sister-in-law's aloofness, the second prince proffered a gift. He hoped to use it to get closer to Qin Yidong. On the surface, he claimed he wanted to be friends, but his heart held a darker purpose. The second prince declared that he could see Qin Yidong's dislike for the crown prince. He pointed out how the crown prince left her alone in the palace while he gallivanted about freely. Qin Yidong didn't take this blatant attempt to sow discord to heart, but the second prince seemed unusually agitated. The second prince then proposed a deal. If Qin Yidong would keep him informed of the crown prince's movements, he promised to help her escape the palace. Qin Yidong feigned excitement. Such a generous offer, it would be rude to refuse. Beneath Qin Yidong's cheerful smile, their agreement was struck. The second prince was delighted and, after a brief exchange, left the Eastern Palace in high spirits. As soon as he was gone, Qin Yidong's expression changed. This so-called palace intrigue was truly tiresome. That night, as Qin Yidong sat alone in her room, she suddenly stood up. A dark figure flashed past the door. The crown prince materialized, pulling Qin Yidong into his arms. They hurried to the courtyard. Before either could speak, Qin Yidong punched him in the face. "You idiot, sneaking around like that in your own home. You nearly gave me a heart attack." The crown prince chuckled ruefully. They ascended to the rooftop once more. A clandestine meeting within the palace walls at this hour wasn't for idle chatter. As soon as they sat down, Qin Yidong recounted the day's events to the crown prince. This was the reason she had summoned him in the dead of night, to devise a counter-strategy. The crown prince was taken aback. The deal seemed advantageous for Qin Yidong, and he was completely unaware of it. He couldn't understand why she would tell him about it. Qin Yidong was momentarily speechless at his confusion. Even if it benefited her, she wouldn't betray him. The crown prince felt a pang of frustration. Despite their conversations, he still couldn't decipher what she truly wanted. Qin Yidong simply stated that she desired a peaceful, carefree life. The crown prince looked at her quizzically. Given their current predicament, Qin Yidong believed the crown prince was far more intelligent and honorable than the second prince. That was why she had decided to side with him. The crown prince couldn't help but smile at her words. The inner palace was a chaotic place. Fortunately, it wouldn't be long before he could take her away from it all. Elsewhere, the second prince and Qi's most beautiful woman were inexplicably speeding down a metaphorical highway. They discussed the day's transaction with the crown princess. It turned out the whole thing had been orchestrated by the second prince. He knew Qin Yidong would inform the crown prince, but proceeded with the deal anyway. His aim was to provoke the crown prince into a rash act. Under his watchful eye, Yuan Zixian praised his ingenuity. The second prince grasped her delicate chin, promising to make her his empress if he ascended the throne. The next morning, the court officials gathered in the grand hall. The western drought had become severe. Assembled courtiers pleaded with the emperor to dispatch officials to address the crisis. Before anyone could volunteer, Crown Prince Liang Xian stepped forward, requesting to be sent west to manage the relief efforts. At his words, the second prince shifted uneasily. The emperor paused, then granted the crown prince's request. But everyone at court knew this mission to the west was a dangerous gamble. The second prince, especially, would surely use this opportunity to stir up trouble. Despite this, the crown prince appeared remarkably calm. This apparent composure only fueled the second prince's murderous intent towards his older brother. Meanwhile, Qin Yidong, the crown princess, was furious when she learned she was also expected to travel west. "I'm leaving the palace, yes, but I never agreed to become the emperor's errand girl. Who said I'd go with you to manage some drought? You and your big, fat mess, crown prince." Despite Qin Yidong's vehement protests, she eventually found herself on the road to the west. Though the burden of the western mission was heavy, leaving the palace offered a measure of freedom she hadn't enjoyed before. Seeing the crown prince astride his tall horse only stoked her ire. Suddenly, a commotion ahead drew everyone's attention. A large group of refugees blocked the road. The Western crisis had clearly spiraled out of control. Chuanxia, Qin Yidong's maid, immediately wanted to share their provisions with the starving people. Unexpectedly, Qin Yidong refused. While she pitied the refugees, their meager supplies wouldn't alleviate the suffering. Furthermore, such open generosity in broad daylight would only incite a frenzy. The crown prince agreed. They had been traveling for 10 days. These desperate people were driven to cannibalism. One wrong move could spell disaster for the entire caravan. Qin Yidong decided to press on. She would address the food crisis for all the refugees once they reached the west. The road became increasingly treacherous. Suddenly, a riot erupted among the refugees ahead. To quell the unrest, the crown prince rode ahead to subdue the crowd, leaving Qin Yidong behind to avoid the danger. Qin Yidong anxiously assessed the situation. The crisis was far worse than she had imagined. Nearby, refugees whispered amongst themselves. Driven by desperation, they decided to seize Qin Yidong's carriage. Without food, they would all perish in this desolate wasteland. Several refugees charged towards the carriage, screaming for food and water. Qin Yidong's heart sank. The worst had come to pass. She ordered Chuanxia to flee and promised to retrieve her from the forest once the chaos subsided. After sending Chuanxia away, Qin Yidong sighed heavily. The refugees outside continued their desperate cries. With a resolute expression, she stepped down from the carriage. She commanded the refugees to stop. The guards rushed forward, apologizing profusely. If any harm befell the crown princess, they would all pay with their lives. Qin Yidong produced a bag of dried rations. She gave them a choice: take the food and leave, or continue their assault on the carriage. If they chose the latter, she would show no mercy, killing anyone who approached. Qin Yidong's fierce declaration stunned both the refugees and the guards. Seeing that Qin Yidong was not to be trifled with, the refugees quickly chose the first option. However, after receiving the food and water, their attention turned back to the carriage. Qin Yidong had been generous, but if they pushed their luck, she would be forced to draw her sword. The tension reached a fever pitch. Finally, after much struggle, the crown prince, who had been riding ahead, managed to suppress the riot. With the situation seemingly under control, he immediately turned back to escort Qin Yidong into the city. Meanwhile, surrounded by the refugees, Qin Yidong wielded her sword, fending off their attacks. The timely arrival of the crown prince brought a wave of relief. In a matter of moments, his guards formed a protective circle around the carriage. Seeing that Qin Yidong had managed to control the situation before his return, Liang Xian praised his beloved wife. Qin Yidong smiled proudly, but then a thought struck her. Had he deliberately delayed his return, leaving her to deal with the conflict alone? But remembering that Liang Xian had also faced mortal danger, she couldn't help but embrace him. The crown prince whispered something in Qin Yidong's ear, causing her to blush crimson. She responded by playfully shoving him. Time passed. After enduring numerous hardships, Qin Yidong finally arrived at the main city in the western region. Looking at the bright red handprint on the crown prince Liang Xian's face, Qin Yidong felt no remorse whatsoever. Hand in hand, the two arrived at the luxurious mansion the crown prince had prepared in the west half a month prior. It turned out that the crown prince's 2-month disappearance had been spent establishing this western residence. Together, they stepped inside. The moment they entered, Qin Yidong suddenly realized she had forgotten something, but try as she might, she couldn't recall what it was. Late that night, Chuanxia, alone and shivering, hid in the woods. Remembering Chuanxia, Qin Yidong immediately brought her back to the mansion. The poor maid had nearly resigned herself to perishing in the western wilderness. Just then, the crown prince, exhausted from a long day, returned to the mansion. The drought in the west was far more severe than initially anticipated. If sufficient water sources couldn't be found, the entire western region would become a wasteland. The consequences would be catastrophic. Unfortunately, artificial rainmaking didn't exist in this era. To truly alleviate the drought, more unconventional methods were required. Seeing that Qin Yidong seemed to have something to say, the crown prince placed the heavy burden of managing the drought relief efforts squarely on her shoulders. After all, she was the crown princess and should share the responsibilities of state affairs with her husband. With that, Liang Xian gently kissed Qin Yidong's forehead. Faced with such a charming gesture, Qin Yidong blushed. Flustered, she quickly dodged Liang Xian's display of affection, unaware that everything they did was being observed by a hidden spy. The crown prince, sensing something amiss, gave a cold smile. Elsewhere, the spy reported everything that had transpired within the mansion to an assassin. From the moment Qin Yidong and the crown prince had departed, they had been targeted for assassination. However, the assassin's primary target was the crown prince. Qin Yidong was to be captured alive and brought back to the capital. Every move the crown prince and Qin Yidong made was being documented by the spy and relayed to the assassin. Late at night, as Qin Yidong slept soundly, a piercing scream jolted her awake. Startled, the crown princess fell out of bed. The next morning, the crown princess, disguised as a man to investigate the drought, braved the scorching summer heat and visited several villages. The drought was severe. If a solution wasn't found soon, the refugees throughout the western region would likely revolt. All the reservoirs in the west were now dry. Qin Yidong had to race against time to reach the last remaining village. Meanwhile, at the military camp on the western border, the crown prince was negotiating with the general stationed there. He had discovered that the general had recently become quite close with the second prince. Such an alliance was a sensitive matter in the imperial court. However, the crown prince hadn't come to punish wrongdoing, but to sway the general's loyalty to his side. Now, all the forces on the border had aligned themselves with the crown prince. The general realized his precarious position, especially since his eldest son was even closer to the second prince. To protect his son's life, the general had no choice but to pledge allegiance to the crown prince. This was precisely what Liang Xian had intended. Meanwhile, Qin Yidong, while visiting the villages, encountered trouble. A group of masked assassins ambushed her entourage. She hadn't expected to encounter assassins in such a remote and desolate place. The assassins swarmed, quickly surrounding Qin Yidong and her companions. The guards had no choice but to sacrifice themselves to cover her escape. A flurry of blades flashed. The assassins pursued Qin Yidong relentlessly. Suddenly, she stopped, her gaze fixed on a blade one of the assassins had dropped. To protect herself and her remaining companions, she had only one option. She picked up the blade and fought back against the assassin's deadly pursuit. Fortunately, her remaining guard intervened, momentarily resolving the immediate threat. The lead assassin gave the order to capture Qin Yidong alive, no matter the cost. Qin Yidong scoffed, slashing at the assassins with the stolen blade. The guard, seeing no other option, quickly secured Chunxia and joined the fight alongside Qin Yidong. Qin Yidong fought with surprising ferocity. The assassins were shocked that this seemingly delicate woman could hold her own against their trained attacks. Even more unexpected was that in the midst of the chaos, Qin Yidong discarded her weapon and blocked a deadly blow with her bare hand. Then, with a swift kick, she sent the assassin flying. The throng of assassins scattered, clutching their heads. As they fled, Qin Yidong collapsed to the ground, weak with relief. These assassins had dared to attack in broad daylight, and their target had been the crown prince's beloved consort. There had to be a powerful force manipulating them from the shadows. With no other choice, Qin Yidong postponed her plans to visit the villages and return to the mansion to recover. Back in her room, Qin Yidong cried out in pain. Seeing the severity of her mistress's injuries, Chunxia, her maid, felt a pang of Xn1 tongue too, heartache/distress, and couldn't help but scold her. But Qin Yidong explained that if she had chosen to flee and let the guards take the brunt of the attack, the casualties would have been far worse. Besides, she added, placing her life entirely in the hands of others was never a wise decision. Just then, the crown prince arrived breathless. Upon hearing of Qin Yidong's injuries, he had ridden at breakneck speed from the border. Thankfully, Qin Yidong's life was not in danger. Otherwise, even the crown prince would have been consumed by regret. Had anything truly dire befallen Qin Yidong, the crown prince would have made every single accompanying guard pay with their lives. Qin Yidong was taken aback by his words. Just moments ago, his gaze had been so tender. Now, in the blink of an eye, he spoke with such chilling ruthlessness. Perhaps this was the crown prince's true nature. To change the subject, Qin Yidong quickly brought up the drought in the western region. The northwest was mostly sunny. The crown prince had previously commissioned the construction of numerous reservoirs to combat the drought. But under this scorching summer sun, such efforts were merely a drop in the bucket. A truly permanent solution to the drought in the northwest would require a massive, nationwide undertaking. A canal diverting water from the south to the north. A suitable route would need to be found across the entire empire. A channel dug from the rain-rich southern lands, stretching all the way north, bringing the southern waterways to the northwestern border. This would finally resolve the drought. Hearing Qin Yidong propose such a grand solution, even the crown prince was stunned. Such an ingenious idea. Had she truly conceived it herself? Qin Yidong could only offer a hesitant confirmation. At her words, the crown prince's gaze sharpened. Now that a solution was presented, he demanded that Qin Yidong draft a detailed proposal as soon as she recovered. Qin Yidong felt a surge of resentment. After a brief respite, the assassins who had attacked Qin Yidong were captured by the crown prince's men. It wouldn't be long before their interrogation revealed the mastermind behind the attack. At that moment, the crown prince issued a secret order. He instructed Manhwa, his most formidable covert agent, to discreetly investigate the Qin family. Qin Yidong's proposal for diverting the southern waters had inadvertently aroused his suspicion. Meanwhile, Qin Yidong tossed and turned in bed. The day's events had created a rift between them, and she dreaded further conflict with the crown prince. Suddenly, a strange noise drifted in from outside the window. Still on edge after the assassination attempt, Qin Yidong's senses were heightened. She grabbed a pair of scissors and lunged towards the window, ready to strike. Thankfully, she stopped herself just in time. Otherwise, she might have inadvertently widowed herself. The sudden attack aggravated her injuries. This blasted crown prince was always sneaking around. Why was he creeping into her room in the dead of night? Just as she opened her mouth to scold him, the drunken crown prince lurched forward and practically fell on top of her. The overwhelming stench of alcohol made Qin Yidong feel like she'd fallen into a vat of wine. She tried to push him away, but in the next instant, the crown prince looked at her with such pathetic puppy dog eyes. Like a large, forlorn dog, terrified she might abandon him. Qin Yidong was astonished. The usually boisterous crown prince was so docile when drunk. He clung to her, murmuring about sleeping together. Qin Yidong meant to refuse, but looking at Liang Xian's expression, a surge of maternal tenderness welled up within her. They nestled together, Liang Xian clinging to her like a child. He demanded cuddles and kisses, then asked Qin Yidong to sing him a lullaby. After a moment's thought, she began to hum a song from her childhood. The familiar melody evoked memories of his mother for the crown prince. Suddenly, he sobered up and in a swift motion pinned Qin Yidong beneath him. The next morning, as Qin Yidong walked through the courtyard, her mind replayed the crown prince's question from the night before. Where did she truly come from? Qin Yidong was filled with unease. Had her unusual behavior finally aroused his suspicion? How was she going to handle this? She couldn't possibly tell Liang Xian the truth, that she was a traveler from the future. Meanwhile, the assassin's identity had been revealed through interrogation. He was one of the Yuan family's assassins. The crown prince's expression was laced with contempt. His second brother, in his meticulous planning with the Taoist priest, had conspired in this assassination attempt. He'd already approached the Yuan family to serve as scapegoats. And that foolish Yuan Zixian actually believed the second prince would make her his empress. He wondered what Yuan Zixian would think if she saw the assassin's current pathetic state. Suddenly, a ghostly voice drifted in from outside the cell, casting an eerie pall over the prison.